Hey there and welcome back. If you have reached the end of a lengthy day and you are ready to set the whole weight of it down and let your mind drift somewhere gentle and far away, then you have come to exactly the right place tonight. This is an hour for slow breathing and a still room and the soft dark gathering quietly at the edges of the lamplight. And it is for you, whoever you are and wherever in the world you happen to be lying as you listen. Tonight I want to take you an extended way back and a lengthy way off into a small and almost forgotten corner of old Germany. And I want to tell you the tale of a woman whom history has very nearly left out altogether. A princess of a tiny duchy who watched her younger sister carried off to become a queen over the sea. She was the elder of the two, the cleverer of the two by some accounts, the firstborn in the family. And in the very same summer that fortune lifted her little sister onto one of the greatest thrones in the world, that same turn of fortune quietly reached into this elder sister's life and took from her the one thing she most wanted, a marriage to the man she loved. Before this evening is over, you will understand exactly how that happened and why, and what kind of mortal course a woman makes for herself after the door to her own contentment has been gently and firmly closed. Before we go any further into her world, let me say a still word to you, the one listening now, because the company on a journey like this matters more than people tend to think. If you find that these long, slow evenings of history are a good way to ease the mind and drift towards sleep, then you are very welcome to subscribe and to travel with me again on other nights, and I would genuinely love to know where in the world you are listening from and what the hour is there, whether it is deep dark night outside your window or whether the afternoon is only just beginning to wear thin. I look through the little notes that people leave far more often than you might guess, and there is something steadying in the thought of all of us, scattered across so many countries and so many separate lives, gathered for a while in the same old quiet story. So settle yourself however you are most comfortable. Let the day you have had begin to loosen and fall away, and let us go together into the lost world of the sibling who stayed behind. Picture this: a low green country in the flat north of Germany, lying quiet under a wide and colourless sky, a land of still lakes and reed beds and slow brown rivers, of small fields and smaller towns, where on most days the loudest sound is the wind moving through the birch trees and the far-off rattle of a single cart on a country road. It is the middle decades of the 1730s, and we are in the duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, one of those countless little German states into which the old empire of Central Europe was endlessly divided, each with its own duke and its own unassuming court and its own small ceremonies, most of them poor, most of them obscure, and none of them counting for anything much in the affairs of kings. And there, in a tranquil town called Miro, beside a grey and gleaming lake, stands a plain country castle of no great size, the Lower Castle, the home of the younger branch of the ruling family. In a plain set of rooms in that house, in the cold December of 1735, with the lake freezing beyond the windows and the candles lit early against the lengthy northern dark, the first child is born to the prince and princess of this lesser place. They name her Christiane, Sophie Albertine. No bells ring across Europe at the news. No ambassadors hurry to report it abroad. She is the firstborn daughter of a minor prince of a minor duchy, and the wide world, busy with its wars and its glittering capitals, takes no notice of her at all. It is the quietest, smallest, most unwatched of beginnings, and that is exactly where her long and tender story starts. Let us stay a while in Miro, because to understand Christiane, you have to understand the smallness and the stillness of the place that made her, and that held her, and that she would never truly leave for as long as she lived. Mecklenburg-Strelitz was not a kingdom, and never pretended to be one. It was a duchy, and a poor one at that, a stretch of sandy farmland and lake and dark forest set down in the flat North German plain, and its rulers, though they carried the grand old title of Duke, lived in a style that a comfortable English squire would have thought distinctly plain. That the household Christiane was born into was the younger line, the cadet branch, holding the little towns of Miro and Nemero, and her father was a younger son of a younger son, a prince with a courtesy title and an unassuming income, and no real expectation of ever ruling anything at all. They were grand in name and humble in fact, and the castle at Miro showed it exactly, a comfortable, unpretentious country house rather than a true palace, its rooms warmed by tall tiled stoves against the extended northern winters, its windows looking out over the lake to the church and the few sleepy streets of the little town. It was, by the measure of the grand courts of Europe, almost a rural upbringing, and that quiet rusticity shaped every one of the children who grew up there. There was no glittering ceremony at Miro, no crowd of fawning courtiers, no endless daily theatre of rank such as filled the hours at Versailles or Vienna. There was a family in a country house, living a life that was orderly and pious and close to the turning of the seasons. The children grew up knowing the smell of the lake water in summer and the bite of hard frost in winter, the rhythm of the church bells and the slow country year, the plain food and the plain manners of a plain German court that could not have afforded to be otherwise. They scholarly early the habits that would mark them all their lives, a deep and unshowy religious faith, a love of order and economy, a settled suspicion of extravagance and display. It was the kind of upbringing that did not dazzle but did endure, the kind that put something solid and quiet at the centre of a person that no later turn of fortune can easily shake loose. And the duchy itself reinforced that deep quietness. Mecklenburg had been ravaged in the terrible wars of the previous century, its lands fought over and burned, its people impoverished and scattered, and it had never fully recovered. It remained one of the most backward and old-fashioned regions of the whole empire, a standing where time itself seemed to move more slowly than elsewhere, where the old ways held on long after they had faded in busier lands. The nobility still ruled the countryside in the ancient manner, the peasantry still bound to the soil, the towns small and sleepy, the whole duchy a kind of still backwater eddy at the edge of the vast rushing river of European affairs. Nothing happened in Mecklenburg-Strelitz that the wider sphere cared to notice, and that very obscurity, that perfect insignificance, was the air that Christiane breathed from her first day to her last. For here is the thing to hold in your mind about her, the thing that sets her apart from the sibling, whose fame would one day eclipse her own. Christiane stayed. Her whole span, from the cradle to the grave, was lived within the bounds of this obscure German world. She was born in the duchy, she grew up in the duchy, she would grow old in the duchy, and she would die in the duchy, and be buried in the very church at Miro, within sight of the rooms where she had first drawn breath. The towering wide world that would one day open up so dramatically for her little sister never opened for Christiane, while Charlotte would cross the sea and reign over millions, and have her name carried to the far corners of the earth. The elder kept to the quiet country of her childhood, to the lakes and the forests and the lesser courts of the north. The whole arc of her days contained within a landscape you could ride across in an extended day. There is no tragedy in that smallness by itself, of course. A life lived quietly in one's own country, among one's own people, close to the things one knows and loves, can be a deeply contented course, and we should be careful not to pity Christiane merely for staying home. Many people in every age live and die within a few miles of where they were born, and are none the worse for it. But in her case, the smallness takes on a particular colour, a particular poignancy, because of what almost happened and did not. There was a moment, one bright, dangerous summer, when Christiane too stood at the edge of a vast change, when a door swung open that might have carried her off to a different country and a different life and a joy of her own choosing. And then the door closed, and she remained, as she had always been, the daughter of the minor duchy by the lake, while her sister sailed away into history. To understand the weight of that closed door, though, we first have to understand the kin it closed upon, and so let us turn now to the house at Miro, and the children growing up in it, and the eldest of them all. Let us step inside the lower castle at Miro and look about us, for the material world in which Christiane spent her childhood was a particular one, and to know it is to know her better. This was no soaring palace of marble halls and gilded staterooms such as the grand kings of Europe inhabited. It was a country house, comfortable and solid and plain, built for living in rather than for overawing visitors, a residence suited to the unassuming means of a younger branch of a minor ducal family. Its walls held in the warmth against the lengthy northern winters, and its rooms were heated, in the German fashion, by tall stoves of glazed tile that stood in the corners and threw out a steady, gentle heat through the cold months, very different from the open hearths of an English house. The windows looked out through the still water of the lake, and in winter the lake would freeze and the world beyond the glass would go white and silent, and the household would draw close around the warm stoves through the extended dark evenings. The life lived in those rooms was orderly and unhurried, governed by the round of the day and the round of the year. There was the chapel, for this was a deeply pious household, and the day was framed by prayer, and the week by worship, the kin gathering for their devotions as naturally as they gathered for their meals. There was the schoolroom, where the children took their lessons under their tutors, the serious daily work of an education that, as we have seen, was more thorough than the plain setting might suggest. There were the everyday rooms of family life, where the children played and the women sewed, and the household went about its quiet business. And there were the gardens, for a house like this would have its grounds, its walks and its plantings, where the children could run and the household could take the air, and where, perhaps, the young Christiane first found that love of growing things that her sister would later carry to such fame at Kew. It was a self-contained world, the castle and its grounds, and the little town of Muro around it, and the kin lived within it in a way that is hard for us now to imagine. There was no rushing off to the capital, no constant traffic of fashionable visitors, no whirl of social engagements such as filled the lives of the grander nobility. There was the household, and the household within it, and the small town beyond the gates, and the quiet country stretching away on every side. The rhythms of her days were the rhythms of a country house in a sequestered province, the seasons turning, the church bells ringing, the daily round of prayer and lessons and meals and family gathering. It was, by the standards of the vast world, a span almost monastic in its quiet regularity, and it bred in the children who grew up in it a deep familiarity with quietness, an inwardness, a capacity to find their lives within a small compass rather than in the noise and spectacle of an immense court. And it was a frugal world too, for the kin was not rich, and the management of the household was a matter of careful economy. There was no extravagance at Miro, no reckless display, no spending beyond the lesser means of a younger ducal line. The household was run with thrift and order, every expense considered, every resource carefully husbanded, and the children absorbed that habit of economy as they absorbed everything else, the air of a house where money was respected and waste was frowned upon. It is one of the things that would later astonish the English court about Charlotte, her careful management and her dislike of extravagance, and it came directly from this frugal upbringing at Miro, where the daughters of the house erudite, that even princes must live within their means. Christiane well read the same lesson, and carried the same habits of economy and good management through her entire span, the thrifty, ordered ways of the unassuming German court in which she was raised. This, then, was the material setting of Christiane's whole childhood and youth. The plain, comfortable castle by the lake, with its tiled stoves and its chapel, and its schoolroom and its gardens. Its quiet, ordered, frugal life turning with the seasons in a forgotten corner of Germany. It was the world that shaped her, and in a deep sense it was the only world she ever truly knew. For though her later days would take her to the slightly grander court of Strelitz, she never left the obscure German sphere into which she had been born. The lake and the stoves and the chapel and the quiet, ordered days were the furniture of her decades from her first years to her last. And when we picture her, at any stage of her long course, we should picture her against this background, the plain, warm country house in the flat green land, the still water and the wide, pale sky, the quiet, pious, frugal world that made her what she was, and that she carried in her heart wherever that period took her. Christiane was the firstborn, and that simple fact placed her at the head of a large and growing family, and shaped the part she would play in it all her days. Her father was Charles, the Prince of Miro, a man of whom history records little beyond his decency, his piety, and his early death. Her mother was Elisabeth Albertine, a princess of another small German house, Saxe-Hildburghausen, who had married Charles and come to the quiet castle by the lake to begin the lengthy work of raising a family in its plain rooms. And raise a family she did, on the grand old scale of the age. 10 children in all were born to Charles and Elisabeth Albertine in that time that followed, though the cruel arithmetic of that century took its heavy toll, and only 6 of the 10 lived past the dangerous perils of infancy. Christiane stood at the very top of that ladder of children, the eldest, the first, born nearly a decade before the youngest of her surviving sisters, so that she grew up not only as a daughter of the house, but, increasingly, as a kind of elder presence among the younger ones, a half-grown girl already when the babies that came after her were small. Picture the house in that period, full of the noise and the warmth and the griefs of a large family in a small home. There were the brothers, several of whom would matter to Christiane all her days. There was Adolphus Frederick, born a few years after her, the boy who would one day become the reigning duke and the head of the whole household, and who would be Christiane's closest companion through the extended decades of her middle and final years. There's Charles, another brother, who would in his turn also come to rule the duchy. There were the younger children coming along one after another, the cradle never empty for long, the nursery a constant changing population of infants and toddlers and small children, with all the love and all the loss that such a crowded family knew in an age when so many small lives flickered out before they had properly begun. And moving through all of it, the eldest, the steady one at the top, was Christiane. To be the firstborn in such a family, and a daughter at that, carried a particular role and a particular weight. The eldest girl in a profound household was, almost by necessity, a second mother to the younger ones, a helper and a minder and an example, drawn early into the work of caring for the smaller children who came tumbling after her. We have no diary of Christiane's girlhood, no letters from those early years, no record of the daily texture of her childhood, for no one thought to write down the doings of an obscure princess in a little duchy. But we can reconstruct the shape of it from what we know of such families and such households, and from what Christiane became. She grew up surrounded by younger siblings, with all the responsibilities and the affections that the eldest of many children knows, scholarship early, the patience and the steadiness and the quiet sense of duty that mark a person who has helped to raise others from her own childhood on. And there is one fact that tells us something true about her position and her character. Of all the daughters born to Charles and Elisabeth Albertine, only 2 would live to grow to womanhood, Christiane the eldest and Charlotte the youngest, with 9 many decades between them. The second girls were lost. Small lives that began and ended in the perilous early years, leaving these two sisters at the opposite ends of the family, the elder and the younger, the first and the last of the daughters to survive. That gap of 9 years and that shared survival in a family that buried its other girls drew the two of them into a particular closeness, the kind of bond that forms between an older sister and a much younger one who is half a daughter to her. We will come to that bond in a moment, for it is one of the towering threads of Christiane's whole course. But first hold this picture of her in your mind, the eldest child of the little castle by the lake, the steady elder presence in a crowded, loving, often grieving household, the firstborn who carried from her earliest years the quiet weight of being the one the others looked up to. It was not a glamorous role, and it left no monuments. The eldest daughter of a minor German duke was not a figure the world watched or recorded, but it was the foundation of everything Christiane became, the soil in which her deep, patient, dutiful, self-effacing character grew, the very qualities that would later let her bear without bitterness the loss of her own gladness, were the qualities of the eldest child, schooled from infancy in patience and in service, and in putting others first. She was, you might say, formed by her kin before she was formed by anything else, and the family, large and warm and often sorrowful, was the grand fact of her early years, as it would remain, in one form or another, the vast fact of all her decades. And at the heart of that family, growing up close beside her in the quiet rooms of Miro, was the little sister who would one day change everything. Now let us turn to the bond that lies at the very heart of Christiane's story, the bond between her and her younger sister, the little girl who would one day be Queen Charlotte. They were the only two daughters of the house to survive, and there were 9 years between them. Christiane, born in the December of 1735, Charlotte not until the May of 1744. 9 years is a deep gulf between sisters when they are children, the elder already half grown when the younger is still an infant, and it meant that the relationship between them was never quite the equal sisterhood of girls close in age, squabbling and confiding as near twins do. It was something gentler and more maternal than that. To the baby Charlotte, the 9-year-old Christiane would have been almost a grown person, a big sister who was practically a young aunt, one of the warm presences who helped to tend and mind and raise her in the crowded nursery of Miro. Try to imagine the two of them in those early years. The elder girl growing toward womanhood, serious and studious and dutiful, already drawn into the care of the younger children, and the small one, the youngest, surviving daughter, the baby of the child's, growing up under the eye and the affection of her much older sister. There is a particular tenderness in the love between a big sister and a little one separated by so much time, a love that has in it something of the parent, as well as the sibling, the elder feeling protective and responsible, the younger looking up with trust and admiration. We have no letters from those nursery years to prove the texture of it, but everything that came later, the lifelong correspondence, the closeness maintained across an ocean, the grief at the parting, and the grief at the end, tells us that the bond forged in the quiet rooms of Miro was deep and genuine and lasting. These two sisters, the first and the last of their mother's surviving daughters, loved one another, and that love would outlast every distance and every change that life could throw between them. And here is the thing that gives their sisterhood its particular poignancy, looking back over the centuries. In those early years at Miro, there was no reason on earth to think that the younger's life would be any grander than the elder's. They were both daughters of the same minor prince, both raised in the same lesser castle, both destined, in the ordinary course of things, for the same kind of future, a respectable marriage to some neighbouring German prince, or perhaps no marriage at all, and a hushed life as a canoness or a maiden aunt of the duchy, If anything, the firstborn, the more scholarly of the two, might have seemed the one more likely to make a good match and a notable career. The little one was the baby, the youngest, the least regarded. No fortune-teller looking at the two girls in the nursery at Miro would have picked out the small one as the future queen of a mighty kingdom and marked the elder for a course of quiet renunciation at home. And yet that is exactly how it would fall out, and the very evenness of their childhood, the way they started from the same little place with the same small prospects, makes the vast divergence of their later lives all the more striking. For most of their childhood, then, they were simply sisters, the two surviving girls of the house, sharing the same schoolroom and the same chapel, and the same steady round of a little court's year. They had in common their tutors, as we shall see, and got their education side by side, the elder ahead of the younger by those 9 years, but both of them taught by the same serious hands. They had in common the losses that fell on the family, the deaths of the second children, and in time the death of their father, and at last the death of their mother. That they had in common the whole small world of Miro, its lake and its gardens and its church and its unassuming rooms, and they had in common it as sisters who genuinely loved one another, the elder a steadying presence to the younger a beloved charge to the elder. It was, by every sign we have, a happy and a tender sisterhood, one of the good things of both their lives. That is why what came later cuts so deep, because the two of them who had grown up so close, who had in common everything, who had loved one another through all the small joys and sorrows of a still childhood, would be divided by the cruelest of ironies, and divided in a way that made the youngest's rare good fortune the direct cause of the elder's deep loss. The crown that came to Charlotte was the very thing that took from Christiane her one chance at love and marriage, so that the rise of the one was bound up, inextricably and painfully, with the renunciation of the other. And yet, and this is the wonder of it, the bond between them survived even that. The love that had been forged in the nursery at Miro was strong enough to outlast even the strange, cruel symmetry of their fates, and the pair would write to one another faithfully beyond the sea for the rest of their lives, the queen and the one left behind, bound by a sisterly love that no crown and no ocean and no broken engagement could ever quite break. But all of that is still far ahead. For now they are two girls in a schoolroom, and it is to that schoolroom, and the unusual education that shaped them both, that we turn next. Let us linger now over the childhood years themselves, the lengthy stretch of growing up in the castle by the lake, for it was in that time that Christiane became the person she would always be, and it was in those years that the bond with her little sister was forged that would last both their lives. Picture the nursery at Miro through the 1740s and into the 50s, a busy, crowded place, for the household was large and the children came one after another, and the rooms given over to the young ones were rarely quiet. There were babies and toddlers and small children, the whole graduated ladder of the surviving sons and daughters, with all the noise and mess and tenderness and grief that such a nursery held in an age when childhood was both cherished and perilous. And presiding among the children, the eldest, the steady big presence, was Christiane. For an eldest daughter in such a household was no idle child, but a working member of the nursery's little world drawn early into the care of the younger ones. By the time the youngest sister, Charlotte, was born, Christiane was already 9 years old, a big girl, half a young woman, well able to help with the baby and the smaller children. She would have held her infant sister, soothed her, watched over her, taken a share in the daily work of tending the little ones, in the way that eldest daughters did and do in every age. There is a particular tenderness in the relation of a much older sister to a baby sibling, a love that has in it something maternal, the elder feeling protective and responsible, the younger growing up under her care. And so Charlotte, the future queen, spent her own earliest years under the eye and the affection of her much older sister, the two of them bound from the very start of the younger one's life by that asymmetrical, tender, almost mother and daughter sort of love between a big sister and a little one. The days of such a childhood had their own shape and their own pleasures. There were the lessons, the serious daily schoolroom work that we have already marked, the languages and the letters and the religion taken under the tutors who shaped the siblings' minds. But a childhood is not all lessons, and there would have been play too, the games of children in a vast country house, indoors by the warm stoves in the extended winters and out in the gardens in the green summers. There would have been music, for music was woven through the life of such a court, and the children would have erudite their keyboards and their songs, the beginnings of that love of music that both sisters carried into their later lives. There would have been the festivals of the church year, the towering feasts of Christmas and Easter kept with the particular customs of the German lands, the celebrations that punctuated the even round of the year with colour and warmth and ceremony. And there would have been, always, the family, the brothers and sisters growing up together, the parents presiding, the whole warm crowded life of a large household in a small home. But the childhood in that age was also shadowed by loss, and the children of Miro knew sorrow early. Of the 10 children born to their parents, 4 did not survive infancy, and that means that the nursery Christiane grew up in was a footing of grief as well as of joy, a standing where small siblings sickened and died, where the cradle that held a new baby one year might be empty the next. Christiane, the eldest, would have known these losses most fully of all the children, old enough to understand and to grieve, watching the younger ones she had helped to tend slip away one after another. It was the common experience of families in that century, this intimacy with the death of children, but it was no less painful for being common, and it surely deepened in Christiane that gravity, that acquaintance with sorrow that marks her whole character. She well read young that the things one loves can be taken away, that life holds loss as well as joy, and the lesson, scholarly in the nursery, would be confirmed again and again across her long span. And running through all of it, the lessons and the play and the festivals and the losses, was the deepening of the bond between the eldest sister and the youngest, between Christiane and the little Charlotte. Over those seasons of their shared childhood, as the elder grew toward womanhood, and the younger from infancy through girlhood, the two of them were knit together by the daily intimacy of a shared home, a shared schoolroom, a shared family, a shared world. They were the only 2 daughters to survive, set apart by that very survival from the siblings who had died, bound to one another as the surviving girls of the house. The 9 years between them meant that theirs was never an equal childish rivalry, but always something gentler, the elder guiding and the younger looking up, and that tender asymmetry would mark their relationship for the rest of their lives. The childhood years at Miro were the foundation of everything that came after, for both sisters, and at their heart was this deep sisterly love, forged in the nursery by the lake, that neither crown nor ocean nor the cruel symmetry of their fates would ever quite break. One of the most surprising things about the two of them of Miro, and one of the things that most distinguishes Christiane, is the quality of the education they received in that small and obscure duchy. You might expect the daughters of a poor minor prince in a backward German state to be barely schooled at all, taught a little needlework and a little piety, and left otherwise to grow up untutored. And indeed, when the younger Charlotte was later being looked over as a possible bride for the King of England, there were anxious murmurs in London about the provinciality of her upbringing, worries that this girl from a backwater would arrive unpolished and uneducated. But the murmurs were unfair, and they missed what the siblings had actually been given, which was a genuine and serious education, more rigorous in some respects than many a grander princess received. For their parents, despite their plain means, cared about study, and hired good tutors for their children, serious men and women who lent the young woman's genuine instruction. The schoolroom at Miro was presided over by tutors whose names have come down to us, clergymen of genuine scholarship, and a cultivated woman who taught the princesses their lessons, and under their hands the pair were given a comprehensive education indeed. They were taught languages, and not merely the fashionable French that every well-bred girl of the age was expected to chatter in, but the serious ancient tongues as well. Christiane erudite Latin, and even Greek, the languages of the old scholars and the classical world, languages that few women of any rank were taught in that century, the preserve of well-read men and clever boys destined for the universities. That a princess of a small German duchy should be schooled in Greek tells you that the education at Miro was no mere ornamental finishing, but a true grounding in letters, a serious cultivation of the mind. The siblings were taught French too, the common language of the courts, and literature and the second accomplishments thought proper. But it is the Latin and the Greek that catch the eye, the mark of a schoolroom that took the minds of its girls seriously. And of the two of them it seems to have been Christiane, the elder, who was the more deeply learned. She had the start of 9 years on her younger sister, of course, but there is more to it than that. By the accounts that survive, the elder girl was the more studious, the more bookish, the one in whom the love of study struck deepest. It is one of the quiet ironies of their two lives that the more scholarly and accomplished sister was the one who stayed home in obscurity, while the less scholarly younger sister was the one carried off to be a queen. The world, of course, does not reward people according to their cleverness, and the choosing of a royal bride had nothing to do with which sister knew the most Greek. But there is something poignant in the thought of the learned elder sister, with her Latin and her classics and her serious cultivated mind, living out her days quietly in the modest duchy, her gifts admired by a few but known to almost no one, while the world's attention fell entirely on the sibling over the sea. We may ask what that scholarship granted her, this education that the world never saw her use on any great stage. It afforded her surely an inner span of true richness, the company of books and ideas and the grand voices of the past, a furnished mind that could keep itself company through the long, still years. A woman with Latin and Greek and a love of reading is never wholly alone, even in the stillest of lives, for she has the whole library of the ages to draw upon, the philosophers and the poets and the historians, a conversation that never ends and never disappoints. We do not know the particular books Christiane loved, or the studies she pursued in her later solitary years, for she left no record of her reading. But we know she had the keys to that inner kingdom, the languages and the study that opened the vast rooms of the mind, and it is pleasant to imagine that the woman who was denied so much in the outer world found a deep and lasting consolation in the inner one, in the quiet company of her books. There is a lesson in it, almost, about the difference between the kind of greatness the world notices and the kind it does not. Charlotte's days would be lived in the full glare of history, her every doing recorded, her name attached to flowers and places and dynasties. Christiane's course would be lived in obscurity, unrecorded and unremarked, and yet it may well have been, in its inner reaches, the richer and more cultivated of the two. The learned elder sister, with her classical languages and her studious habits and her deep reserves of patience and faith, carried within her a wealth that the world never saw and never valued, the wealth of a furnished and disciplined mind. It is one of the things that makes her worth remembering, this hidden cultivation, this quiet learning that flowered in a small German court and was never given a stage. And it makes the sacrifices of her later days the more striking, for the woman who lent up so much was no simple soul, but a person of genuine depth and real learning, who understood, better than most, exactly what she was losing. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the actual schoolroom of the pair and on the people who taught them, for the names of their tutors have come down to us, and they let us picture, more concretely than usual, the daily work of learning that shaped both girls. The education of the princesses of Myro was entrusted to able hands, and two of those hands we can name. There was a learned clergyman who oversaw the instruction of the children, a man of true scholarship who granted the young ones their grounding in letters and religion and the serious matter of an education. And there was a cultivated woman who served as governess to the princesses, a figure of refinement and learning who shaped the childs in the daily intimacy of the schoolroom, guiding their reading and their lessons and their growth. Between them, the clergyman and the governess afforded the sisters of Moreau an education that, as we have seen, was far more thorough than the modest setting might have led the world to expect. Picture the two of them at their lessons, the firstborn and the younger, taught by the same hands in the same rooms, though separated by the 9 years that put Christiane always ahead. The elder would have moved through the curriculum first, mastering the languages and the letters, and the younger would have followed along behind, learning the same things from the same teachers a few years later. There is something pleasing in that image of the shared schoolroom, the two surviving daughters of the house educated side by side, or rather one behind the other, under the same tutors, absorbing the same lessons, formed by the same cultivated influences. Whatever divided their later lives, this they shared, the schoolroom of Moreau and the teachers who shaped them, the common foundation of learning on which both their characters were built. And it was a genuine foundation, not a mere ornamental finishing. The sisters were taught languages in earnest, not only the fashionable French that every well-bred girl acquired, but the serious tongues as well, and in Christiane's case the ancient languages of Latin and even Greek, the marks of a genuine scholarly education. They were given religion, deeply and seriously, the religion that became the steady centre of both their characters. They were taught the practical arts proper to princesses, who would run great or modest households, the management and the economy, and the order that their mother modelled and their tutors reinforced. It was, in sum, a thorough education, one that furnished the mind and formed the character and prepared the young womans for the lives they were expected to lead, and it was given to them in the quiet rooms of a small German castle by tutors whose seriousness belied the obscurity of the place. That this education was the shared inheritance of both sisters is worth holding on to, for it is one more strand of the bond between them. They were not only sisters by blood and by the shared experience of their childhood, they were sisters in learning, formed by the same teachers, grounded in the same letters and the same faith, their minds shaped by the same cultivated hands. When Charlotte went to England and astonished, in time, those who had expected a provincial dunce, it was the schoolroom of Miro that had prepared her, the same schoolroom that had given Christiane her Latin and her Greek. And when Christiane lived out her long still years sustained by her scholarship and her religion, it was again the schoolroom of Miro and the tutors who had taught her there that had given her those deep inner resources. The two of them carried the same foundation through their very different lives, the common gift of their shared education, one more thread binding the queen beyond the sea to the princess who stayed behind. Standing at the centre of the household at Miro, the towering shaping presence in the lives of both sisters, was their mother, Elizabeth Albertine, and it is worth pausing over her, for the woman who raised Christiane left her mark on everything the daughter became. Elizabeth Albertini was a princess of Saxe-Hildburghausen, another of the small German houses, and she had married Prince Charles of Miro in her early 20s and come to the quiet castle by the lake to be its mistress. There she had borne her 10 children and buried the 4 who did not survive, and there she had run the modest establishment of a minor prince with the order and the economy and the quiet competence that the modest courts demanded. She was, by every sign, a capable and dutiful and deeply pious woman, the very type of the good German princess of her age, and she modelled for her daughters day after day through their childhoods exactly the kind of woman they were expected to become. It is from the mother, surely, that both sisters drew the deep traits that marked them all their lives: the unshowy religious faith, the love of order and economy, the patience and the steadiness and the sense of duty. Elizabeth Albertine ran her household on those principles, and her daughters absorbed them with the air they breathed. Charlotte, when she became Queen of England, would astonish the wasteful English court with her thrift and her careful management and her deep domestic order, and every bit of that came from her mother's example at Miro. And Christiane, who stayed in the German world, would carry the same qualities through her long, uneventful course, the same faith, the same self-discipline, the same capacity to do her duty without complaint. The mother was the pattern, and both daughters were cut from it, the one displaying it on an immense foreign stage, the second living it out in obscurity at home, but both of them, recognizably, Elizabeth Albertine's girls. For Christiane, the bond with the mother had a particular closeness, the closeness of an eldest daughter to the woman whose work she shared. The firstborn girl in a profound household stood nearest to the mother, learned the running of the place at her side, took on the care of the younger children as the mother's lieutenant. Christiane would have been her mother's right hand through those decades of the growing family, the eldest daughter helping to manage the nursery and the household, schooled in the practical arts of running an establishment by the most direct of methods, by doing it alongside the woman who knew. That apprenticeship at her mother's side lent Christiane skills she would use her entire span long for the management of a deep household. The ordering of servants and accounts and the daily round was a true and demanding art, and the eldest daughter learned it thoroughly. When in her final years, Christiane kept house for her unmarried brother and acted as the lady of his court, she was drawing on exactly the training her mother had given her decades before, in the busy rooms of Miro. And then came the grand test of Elizabeth Albertine's strength, the test that her daughters watched her meet and learned from. When Prince Charles died, leaving his widow with a house full of children and the affairs of the kin to manage, Elizabeth Albertine did not collapse into helpless mourning. She took up the burden that had fallen on her and carried it. For when the reigning Duke of the whole duchy passed away too, childless, only months after her husband, the duchy passed to Elizabeth Albertine's eldest son, a boy not yet of age, and the widowed mother stepped in to govern as regent until her son should be old enough to rule. So the children of Miro watched their mother become of necessity the ruler of a minor state, carrying the weight of a duchy as well as a family, doing what had to be done with patience and good sense and quiet competence. It was an extraordinary example to set before two daughters, the spectacle of a capable woman shouldering an enormous burden and bearing it with composure, and one wonders how much of the steadiness of both Christiane and Charlotte was learned in those years, watching their mother govern. The mother perished when the elder was already a grown woman, and the younger still a girl of 17, and her death was one of the vast griefs of both their lives, the loss of the centre around which the whole household had turned. But she had given them, before she went, the deepest gifts a mother can give: a settled character, a working faith, a capacity for duty and endurance, and the living example of a strong woman doing hard things well. Christiane carried those gifts through every quiet year that followed. When she granted up her own contentment, when she lived out her long course in service to her household rather than in pursuit of her own desires, when she bore disappointment without bitterness and loneliness without despair, she was being to the last. Her mother's daughter, the eldest girl of Miro, who had learned at Elizabeth Albertine's side what it meant to do one's duty, and to carry one's burden and to keep one's faith through whatever came. The mother was the making of her, and the bond between them, like the bond between the sisters, was one of the towering quiet anchors of Christiane's whole career. The first great grief of her own years fell when she was 16 years old, and it changed the shape of her kin forever. In the summer of 1752, her father, Prince Charles of Miro, died. He was a man of only 44, gone in the prime of his years, leaving his widow with a houseful of children and his eldest daughter, Christiane, at that tender and difficult age of 16, just on the edge of womanhood, suddenly fatherless. The youngest, Charlotte, was only 8, still a small child, and would grow up with only the dimmest memories of the father who passed away when she was so young. But Christiane was old enough to feel the loss fully, old enough to understand what had happened and to grieve it as an adult grieves, and old enough, as the eldest child, to take on a share of the steadying of the family in the dark months that followed. The death of the father was a heavy blow in itself, but it was followed almost at once by an event that transformed the family's whole situation. Only months after Prince Charles died, the reigning Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the head of the senior line, perished as well, and he passed away childless, with no son to succeed him. And so, by the workings of inheritance, the whole duchy passed away from the senior branch and came down to the younger line, to Christiane's own family, and specifically to her eldest brother, Adolphus Frederick, who became, while still a young man not yet of full age, the new reigning Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. In the space of a single year, the family of Miro had gone from being the modest cadet branch, the poor relations holding a couple of small towns, to being the ruling house of the entire duchy. It was a mighty elevation, and it came wrapped in grief, arriving on the heels of the father's death and the old duke's death together. Because the new duke, Christiane's brother Adolphus, was not yet of age to rule in his own right, the government of the duchy fell, for a time, to their widowed mother, who stepped in as regent to hold the state together until her son should come of age. So the household at Miro, and then increasingly the court at Neustrelitz, where the Dukes of Strelitz had their seat, became the centre of a lesser state's government, with the widowed Elizabeth Albertine at its head and her children gathered about her. For Christiane, the eldest daughter, these were seasons of drawing close, of family solidarity in the face of loss and the face of sudden new responsibility. The death of the father had taken away the head of the family, but it had also paradoxically lifted the family up, and the children, fatherless but newly elevated, clung together under their capable mother through the change. These were those years that bound Christiane most tightly to her brother Adolphus, the new young duke, and that binding would shape the whole rest of her years. For Adolphus, as it would turn out, never married. He would rule the duchy as a bachelor, and his eldest sister would become, over the many decades, his companion and his housekeeper and the lady of his court, the woman who stood at his side and ran his household and represented him when he could not be present. The seeds of that lifelong partnership were planted here, in those years after their father's death, when the eldest sister and the eldest son drew close in the work of holding the family and the duchy together. It was an arrangement that would give Christiane a genuine and dignified place in the world, a function and a position, even as it kept her tied to her brother and her duchy and her home. But it was also, in a sense, the beginning of the path that would lead her away from a span of her own, and it is worth seeing how the losses of those early years prepared Christiane for the grand renunciation to come. By the time she was a young woman, she had already buried a father, already watched her household transformed by grief and inheritance, already taken up her share of the burden as the eldest child of a now ruling house. She had learned, young, that life asks hard things of people, and that the duty of those in her position is to bear them. She had watched her mother carry an enormous load with patience and self-possession. She had been schooled by loss and by example in exactly the qualities that would let her later give up her own joy without breaking. When the vast test of her days came, the closing of the door on her own marriage, she met it not as a sheltered girl unacquainted with sorrow, but as a woman who had known grief and duty from her 16th year, who understood what it was to bend her own wishes to the needs of her kin and her position. The father's death was the first hard schooling of her character, and the lessons of it would carry her, in time, through the hardest passage of all. There was one great event of the larger world that broke into the stillness of the sisters' German childhood, and it deserves its place in the history, for it darkened their youth and it touched, in a curious way, the very legend of how their family rose. In the 1750s, while Christiane was growing toward womanhood and Charlotte was still a child, Europe was plunged into a vast and terrible war, the towering conflict that would come to be called the 7 Years' War, a struggle that drew in all the major powers and that fell with particular savagery on the German lands. Armies marched and countermarched through the patchwork of minor states, living off the country as armies did, plundering and burning and laying waste, and the common people of Germany suffered grievously, their fields trampled, their towns occupied, their livelihoods destroyed in the passage of the great campaigns. The flat North German plain where Mecklenburg lay was no stranger to the tread of armies, and the war brought hardship and fear into the quiet world of the sisters' childhood. For Mecklenburg, caught between the great powers, the war was a time of genuine suffering. The duchy lay in the path of the contending armies, and it endured the miseries that fell on small states in the way of great ones, the demands and the requisitions and the depredations of soldiers, the burden of feeding and quartering troops, the disruption and the fear. The common folk of the region bore the worst of it, as the common folk always do in war, their poverty deepened, their lives upended, their small securities swept away in the great clash of kings, and the children of the ruling house, growing up in their castle, would have known of these sufferings, would have heard of the armies and the plundering and the misery of the people, would have felt the shadow of the great war falling across their quiet provincial world. It was their first real acquaintance with the cruelty of the wider sphere, the world beyond the lake and the gardens, the world of armies and kings and the suffering they brought. And here the legend touches the history in a way worth pausing over. There is a story, attached to the younger Charlotte, but belonging to the world of both sisters, that during this time of war, the young princess, moved by the sufferings of the common people of her land, wrote a bold and feeling letter to a vast commander, pleading the cause of the poor and the ravaged countryside, asking that the armies show some mercy to the helpless folk caught in their path. Whether the tale is true in every detail, or whether it was polished and improved in the retelling, it captures something real about the world these sisters grew up in and the consciences they were formed with. For they were raised in a pious and serious household, taught to care about right and wrong, and about the duty of the great toward the helpless, and they grew up in the very years when the sufferings of war were pressing hard upon the people around them. That a young princess of such an upbringing should be moved by that suffering, and should wish to do something about it, is entirely in keeping with everything we know of the family and its values. We do not have a corresponding legend for Christiane, no famous letter, no recorded act of compassion to set beside her sisters, but she grew up in the same household, under the same influences, in the same decades of war, and we may suppose that the same conscience was formed in her, the same awareness of the sufferings of the poor, the same sense of the duties that rank carried the firstborn, the more learned and serious of the two, would surely have felt as keenly as the younger the shadow of the war and the misery it brought, would have absorbed as deeply the pious concern for the helpless that their upbringing instilled. If the world remembers the youngest's compassion through the famous legend and forgets the elders, that is only because the world remembered the younger and forgot the elder altogether. But the conscience was the same, formed in the same house, in the same hard years, and we may be sure that Christiane carried it through her years as surely as her sister did. The war ended, in time as wars do, and the armies withdrew, and the German lands began their slow recovery, and the calm of the sisters' world returned. But those seasons of conflict had left their mark, a darkening of the childhood, an early acquaintance with the cruelty of the larger world and the suffering it could bring. It was against this background of war and its miseries that the sisters grew toward the great turning point of their lives, the choosing of Charlotte to be a queen, which would come only a few years after the fighting ceased. And there is a kind of fittingness in the sequence, that the family which had known the hardships of the war should be lifted so soon after to such dazzling heights. The minor duchy that had suffered the passage of armies, suddenly bound by marriage to one of the greatest thrones in the world. But the lifting, when it came, would carry its own cruelty, woven into the very triumph, and it is to that turning point, and the love that it destroyed, that the sisters' story now moves. The tranquil years of childhood, shadowed by war but anchored in family and faith, were drawing toward their end, and the great divergence of the sisters' fates was about to begin. To understand what happened to Christiane in the fateful summer of her 26th year, we have to understand the strange and cold-blooded world of royal and noble marriage in the 18th century, the marriage market into which a princess like her was born, and through which her whole future would be decided. For a young woman of her rank, marriage was not a matter of the heart at all, or at least it was not supposed to be. It was a matter of state, of policy, of the careful balancing of dynasties and territories and alliances, arranged by parents and ministers, and negotiated like a treaty, with the wishes of the bride herself coming very near the bottom of the list of considerations. A princess was, in the brutal logic of the age, a piece on a board, a means of binding one ruling house to another, and her marriage was an instrument of family advantage long before it was anything to do with her own gladness. The pool from which such marriages were drawn was narrow and particular. A Protestant princess of a German house could be matched only with a husband of suitable rank and the right religion, and the suitable partners were the princes and dukes of the second German states, or occasionally the royal houses of the wider Protestant world. The whole of marriageable Europe, for a girl in Christiane's position, was a kind of vast genealogical chessboard, on which the ruling families endlessly arranged and rearranged their children. This prince for that princess, this duchy bound to that kingdom, the alliances shifting with the politics of the age. Agents and ministers kept careful track of the available candidates, their ranks and their religions and their connections and their dowries, and confidential reports circulated on the looks and tempers and reputations of young women who had no idea they were being weighed and measured for one match or another. It was an unsentimental business, and a girl who entered it could expect to be married off when the time came to whatever suitable prince the negotiations produced, whether she had ever met him or not. For a princess of a small and poor duchy like Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the prospects within this market were modest. The great matches, the marriages into the royal houses of the major powers, went to the daughters of grander and richer families. A girl from an obscure backwater could expect, in the ordinary way of things, to be matched with some neighbouring German prince of similar modest standing, to become the consort of another little court much like the one she had grown up in. That was the likely future stretching before both the sisters of Miro, a respectable but unremarkable marriage to some duke or prince of the North German plain, a life as the lady of a modest court, a tranquil course not so very different from their mother's. There was nothing dazzling in the prospect, but it was the ordinary fate of girls of their kind, and there was no reason to expect anything more for either of them. And there was always, hanging over the daughters of such houses, the second possibility, the possibility that there would be no marriage at all. Not every princess found a husband. The marriage market did not have a footing for everyone, and a girl of a poor house without an immense dowry or a powerful family behind her might simply never be matched, might pass through her marriageable years without an offer suitable enough to accept, and find herself, as those years went on, an unmarried woman of rank with no establishment of her own. For such women there were certain respectable paths, certain dignified positions that an unwed princess could occupy, and we shall come to those, for Christiane would in the end walk one of them. But the point to grasp is that marriage for a woman in her position was never something she could simply choose or pursue for herself. It was something arranged for her, or not arranged, by forces and calculations entirely outside her control, and her own desires had almost nothing to do with it. That is what makes the tale of Christiane and the Duke of Roxburghe so remarkable and so poignant. For what happened to her in that one bright summer was the thing that almost never happened to a princess of her kind. She met a man, and she fell in love, genuinely and mutually, and for one shining moment it seemed that this love might actually become a marriage, that the cold machinery of dynastic arrangement might for once deliver to a woman the thing her own heart desired. It was a rare and precious chance, the chance of a love match in a world that did not deal in love matches, and it came to Christiane unlooked for, a gift of fortune as unexpected as it was wonderful. And then it was taken away, not by any failing of the lovers, not by any change of heart, but by the very triumph of her sister, by the crown that came to Charlotte, and made Christiane's own contentment impossible. To understand how that happened, we must first follow the road that brought a young British duke across Europe to the small courts of Germany, and so let us turn now to the strange institution that carried him there, the Grand Tour. The man who would break Christiane's heart, though he never meant to and grieved it as deeply as she did, came into her days by way of one of the great customs of the age, the Grand Tour. To understand how a young British nobleman came to be travelling through the small courts of North Germany in the year that changed everything, you have to understand this remarkable institution which sent the young gentlemen of Britain out across Europe for years at a time in pursuit of polish and culture and experience. It was in the 18th century the expected finishing of a young man of rank and fortune, the capstone of his education, the great adventure that turned a raw youth into a man of the world. A wealthy young Englishman or Scotsman, having finished with his tutors and his university, would set out with a governor and a train of servants on a journey that might last a year or two or even longer, crossing the Channel and making his way through France and the German lands and over the Alps into Italy, the great goal and treasure house of the whole expedition. The purposes of the tour were several and serious. There was education, the seeing at first hand of the great monuments and paintings and ruins of European civilization, the classical sites of Italy above all, where a young man steeped in Latin and the ancients could walk among the very stones of Rome. There was polish, the acquiring of the languages and the manners, and the easy cosmopolitan address that marked the Finnish gentleman, the rubbing off of provincial roughness in the company of foreign courts and foreign society. There was connection, the meeting of the great and the fashionable across Europe, the building of acquaintance with the nobility of other nations, the entry into the international society of rank that bound the upper classes of every country together. And there was, frankly, pleasure and adventure, the freedom of years abroad, the excitement of travel, the experiences a young man could have far from the watchful eyes of home. The Grand Tour was at once a school, a social passport, and a profound youthful escapade, and through it passed, generation after generation, the cream of British aristocratic youth, The routes of the tour ran over the continent, and they brought the travelling young men into contact with the courts of Europe, great and small. A young nobleman making his way through the German lands would pay his respects at the courts he passed, presenting himself to the local princes and dukes, dining at their tables, attending their entertainments, for the courts were the natural points of contact for a traveller of rank, the places where a foreign gentleman would be received and entertained according to his station. Even the small and obscure courts of the North German plain saw their share of these travelling Britons, young men of fortune passing through on their way to grander destinations, pausing to be received by the local ruling family before moving on. And so it was that the small court of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, sleepy and obscure as it was, lay in the path of the wandering young gentlemen of Europe, and might, on any given season, receive a visitor from far away. It was by exactly this road that John Kerr, the young third Duke of Roxburgh, came into the orbit of Christiane and her household. He was a Scottish nobleman of high rank and considerable fortune, the head of an ancient house, and in the early 1760s he was making his grand tour, travelling through Europe as young men of his kind did, seeing the world and finishing his education and building his acquaintance among the courts of the continent. His travels brought him through the German lands, and there, at one of the small northern courts, his path crossed Christiane's. He was young, he was cultivated, he was a deep nobleman of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, and he was, by the accounts that survive, a man of true refinement and feeling, with a love of books and learning that would later make him one of the most famous collectors of his age. He and the learned, serious, cultivated elder princess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz were, in their tastes and their temperaments, remarkably well suited, and when they met, something kindled between them that was rare indeed in that world of arranged matches, a genuine and mutual attraction. There is a particular poignancy in the way the Grand Tour, that great engine of aristocratic privilege and pleasure, became the unwitting instrument of Christiane's tragedy. The institution that brought Roxburgh to her was a thing of freedom and adventure, and the wide world, the very embodiment of the open horizons that young men of rank enjoyed, and that women of her kind were denied. He could travel the length of Europe, seeing and meeting and choosing as he pleased. She was fixed in her little duchy, waiting to see what marriage, if any, would be arranged for her. And the meeting of these two, the free-travelling duke and the fixed princess, produced the one great chance of love that Christiane's course would offer her. It came to her, as such chances came to women of her position, not through any freedom of her own, but through the wandering of a man who could go where he liked, and it would be taken from her, in the end, by forces just as far beyond her control as the forces that had brought it. But before the taking there was the meeting and the love, and for one bright season the real possibility of joy, and it is to that season that we turn now. And so we come to the one deep love of her own years, the bright brief season that afforded her, for a moment, the prospect of a gladness of her own choosing. In the year 1761, John Kerr, the third Duke of Roxburgh, travelling through the German lands on his grand tour, met Christiane, the elder princess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and the two of them fell in love. It was not a dynastic arrangement, not a match negotiated by ministers over the heads of the couple, but the real thing, a mutual affection that grew between two well-matched people who found in one another something they had not expected to find. By every account that survives, the feeling was genuine on both sides, and it was deep. Here was a princess in her mid-20s, learned and serious, and long past the first bloom of girlhood, who might reasonably have thought that the chance of a love match had passed her by, suddenly courted by a cultivated young duke who delighted in her, and whom she delighted in. And here was a young nobleman of one of the powerful kingdoms of Europe, who might have had his pick of brides, drawn genuinely and warmly to the quiet, bookish, intelligent elder daughter of a small German court. They were, by all the signs, beautifully suited. Roxburgh was a man of refinement and feeling, a lover of books above all, who would in his later days assemble one of the most celebrated private libraries in the world and become a byword among collectors for his learning and his taste. And Christiane was the learned sister, the one with the Latin and the Greek and the studious habits, the cultivated mind that the world never saw on any great stage. Two people of that kind, both serious, both bookish, both drawn to the life of the mind, would have found in one another a rare and precious companionship. The meeting of like with like that makes for the deepest and most lasting of bonds. It was not a marriage of mere convenience or mere policy that was forming between them, but the foundation of a true partnership of souls, the kind of match that people in every age hope for, and that few in that world of arranged unions ever found. For Christiane, after a life lived quietly and dutifully in her modest duchy, it must have seemed like a door swinging open onto a future she had hardly dared to imagine. The romance progressed, and it progressed seriously, far beyond mere flirtation or passing fancy. The affection between them grew until it reached the point of an engagement, and until a formal proposal of marriage was in the air, and the negotiations for such a match had begun. This was no idle dalliance, but a genuine courtship moving toward a genuine marriage, with the Duke seeking Christiane's hand in earnest, and the prospect of a true union taking shape. Imagine what those weeks must have held for her, the elder who had perhaps resigned herself to a sequestered, unmarried life, or to some dutiful arranged match with a neighbouring prince, now finding herself genuinely loved and genuinely courted by a man she genuinely loved in return, with the real possibility before her of a marriage of the heart, a life in the wider sphere, a partnership with a man of her own kind. After all the patient years, all the duty and the service and the quiet renunciation of self that had marked her course as the eldest daughter, here at last was something for her, a contentment that was hers, a love that had come to her unlooked for, and seemed about to become the extraordinary good fortune of her span. We have no letters from Christiane in those weeks, no diary, no record of her own words and feelings, for she left no such intimate testimony behind. But we do not need her words to imagine the hope that must have filled her, the careful, almost disbelieving joy of a serious woman who has, against all expectation, found love. For a person of her age and her position and her unhurried, resigned temperament, this was the thing that did not happen, the gift that fortune so rarely gave, and it had come to her. The whole shape of her future seemed, for one bright season, about to change utterly. She would marry the man she loved. She would become a duchess of one of the mighty kingdoms of Europe. She would have a life and a happiness of her own, chosen and not merely arranged, the rarest of things for a woman in her world. The door stood open, and beyond it lay everything she might have wished. And then, in the very same summer, far over the sea in England, a young king began to search for a wife, and his agents drew up their lists of suitable Protestant princesses, and a name was placed before him, and the door that had opened so wonderfully onto Christiane's happiness began, slowly and irresistibly, to swing shut. For the marriage that was about to be arranged was not Christiane's but her sister's, and the very grandeur of that other marriage, the lifting of the youngest to a throne, would make the firstborn's own modest happiness impossible. The two events fell in the same season, almost at the same moment, the proposal to Christiane and the choosing of Charlotte, and the second would cancel the first. The cruelest symmetry in Christiane's whole story was about to unfold, and it is to that, to the thunderbolt that fell from beyond the sea, that we must now turn. While Christiane was being courted by her duke in the small world of the German courts, an entirely separate drama was unfolding over the sea in England. a drama that had nothing to do with her, and that would nonetheless reach through the water and shatter her happiness. In the autumn of 1760, the old King of Great Britain, George II, had died, and the crown had passed to his grandson, a young man of 22 who became George III. The new king was earnest and dutiful and deeply conscious of the great office that had fallen upon him, and the first and most pressing business of his reign was the securing of the succession, which is to say the finding of a wife. A king must marry, and marry suitably, and produce heirs. And so the search began for a queen, a search that became the great preoccupation of the British court in those first months of the new reign. The requirements were strict and particular. The king's bride must be a princess of suitable royal blood, and she must be a Protestant, and she should ideally come from one of the German houses that had long supplied the consorts of the British royal family. There were complications of the heart, for the young king had been smitten with a beautiful English girl and had nursed hopes of marrying her, but the weight of the throne came down against any such match with a subject, and he was made to understand that his queen must be a foreign princess chosen for reasons of state. And there was the powerful influence of the king's mother, who wanted for her son not a clever, well-connected Englishwoman who might form a rival centre of influence, but a modest, biddable princess from somewhere small and far away, without a mighty family at her back or any taste for politics, a girl who would do her duty and bear her children and stay quietly out of the way. The search, in other words, was for a particular kind of bride, modest and obscure and unthreatening, and the agents of the crown began their discreet survey of the marriageable Protestant princesses of Germany with exactly those qualities in mind. And here is where the two stories collide, with a cruelty almost too neat to be believed. For among the candidates considered and weighed and reported upon was the younger of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Charlotte, the baby of the family, the little sister Christiane had helped to raise. The very obscurity of their minor duchy, which had kept both sisters unknown all their lives, now became Charlotte's great qualification. She was a Protestant of unquestioned princely blood. She came from a tiny state that counted for nothing in the great game of power, bringing no dangerous entanglements and no overweening family. She was reputed to be modest, sensible, good-natured, with no taste for intrigue. She was, in short, exactly the safe, quiet, unthreatening bride the king's mother wanted, and in the summer of 1761, the very season in which the Duke of Roxburghe was seeking Christiane's hand, the choice of the British crown settled upon Charlotte. A proposal of marriage was made to the youngest, and it was accepted, and the small court of Mecklenburg-Strelitz found itself suddenly, dizzyingly, raised up, bound by marriage to one of the greatest thrones on earth. Think of the moment as it must have fallen on that small family by the lake. On the one hand, the most extraordinary good fortune imaginable, the kind of fortune that befell perhaps one girl in a generation, the lifting of the youngest daughter to the throne of Great Britain, an elevation that brought honour and prestige and dazzling connection to the whole house of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The little sister, the baby, was to be a queen. There must have been joy and pride and amazement, the whole household caught up in the wonder of so vast a turn of fortune. And on the second hand, falling in the very same season, almost the same weeks, the quieter drama of the elder and her duke, the courtship moving toward its hoped-for marriage. The two things happened together, the great public triumph and the private hope, side by side in the same family at the same moment, and no one, perhaps, saw at first how the one would destroy the other. For the dreadful truth, which would become clear soon enough, was that Charlotte's elevation did not merely overshadow Christiane's romance, it cancelled it. The very thing that made the younger a queen made the firstborn's marriage impossible. The grandeur that descended on the family was a grandeur that Christiane's modest love match could not survive, for reasons of protocol and politics, and the cold logic of dynastic rank that we shall examine in a moment. The thunderbolt that lifted Charlotte to the throne struck down Christiane's happiness in the same flash. The pair, who had grown up so close, who loved one another so well, were caught in the cruelest of symmetries, the rise of the one purchased, without anyone intending it, at the price of the other's heart. And the elder, who had found love so unexpectedly and held it so briefly, was about to learn that the crown coming to her little sister had quietly sealed the door on her own one chance at happiness. We must understand why, exactly, Charlotte's crown made Christiane's marriage impossible. It is worth pausing to understand the cruel logic of it, for it was not mere bad luck or coincidence, but the working out of the rigid rules of rank and dynasty that governed that world, and the reasons reveal a great deal about the age and about the price that was quietly exacted from the firstborn. The heart of the matter lay in a sudden and dramatic change in the standing of the whole family of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Before Charlotte's marriage, they were the rulers of an obscure and minor duchy, and a match between the elder daughter of such a house and a British duke, an immense nobleman but not a sovereign, would have been entirely suitable, even advantageous, a fine marriage for a princess of a small state. But the moment Charlotte was chosen to be Queen of Great Britain, everything changed. The family was no longer merely the ruling house of a backwater duchy. It was now, by marriage, directly allied to the British crown itself, the family of the Queen. And that new and exalted standing made a marriage between Christiane and a mere duke suddenly problematic. The rules of dynastic precedence were exacting and unforgiving. A family that had just bound itself to a royal throne could not easily marry another of its daughters to a subject, however high-born, of that same throne. For the sibling of the Queen of Great Britain to marry a British duke would have created an awkward and unequal relationship. The Queen's own sister, subordinate in rank to her royal sister, yet married into the British nobility, a tangle of precedents and protocol that the careful guardians of royal poise could not countenance. There were concerns too on the British side, the same concerns that shaped every royal marriage, about the dangers of binding the crown too closely to particular noble families, of raising one house too high through marriage into the royal kin. The match that would have been perfectly fitting for the daughter of an obscure duke became unthinkable for the sibling of a queen, and the very elevation that crowned Charlotte pulled the ground out from under Christiane's feet. And there was a further, sharper edge to it, written into the very treaty that carried Charlotte to England. As part of the marriage settlement, the British side insisted upon a hard condition, a clause forbidding any member of the bride's family from marrying a British subject. The purpose of such a clause was coldly practical, to prevent the Queen's German relations from swarming over to England in the wake of her elevation, and seeking advantage through marriages into the British aristocracy, to keep the foreign family at a careful distance from the great prizes of the British state. On paper, it was a sensible piece of diplomatic precaution, but it fell with crushing weight on Christiane, for the man she loved, the man who had courted her and sought her hand, was precisely a British subject, the Duke of Roxburgh, a peer of the British realm. The clause that was meant to guard against grasping foreign relations reached out and struck down a genuine love match, ended a genuine engagement between two people who truly cared for one another, all so that the cold logic of dynastic precaution could be satisfied. The fine print at the bottom of her sister's glittering marriage treaty was Christiane's heartbreak, written in the careful language of diplomacy, and so the match was forbidden. The courtship that had progressed so far, the engagement that had seemed so near, was broken off, not by any failing of the lovers, not by any cooling of affection, but by the brute force of protocol and politics. Christiane was not permitted to marry her duke. The family, bound now to the British crown, could not allow it. The treaty forbade it. The rules of rank made it impossible, and the two who loved one another were parted, told that their marriage could not be, that the happiness they had found and hoped to keep was forbidden to them by considerations entirely outside their own hearts and wills. There is no record of the scenes that must have attended that breaking, the grief and the protest and the slow, bitter acceptance, for Christiane left no account of her own suffering. But we can imagine well enough what it cost her, this serious, learned, long-patient woman who had found love so unexpectedly and was now made to give it up so that her sister's crown might sit easily. It is one of the most quietly devastating stories in all the annals of these royal families, precisely because it is so undramatic, so bloodless, so coldly logical. There was no villain in it, no cruelty intended, no one who set out to break Christiane's heart. There was only the remorseless machinery of dynastic rule, grinding on as it always did, and a young woman's happiness caught in the gears of it. Her sister did not choose to destroy her. Indeed, Charlotte surely grieved the loss as deeply as anyone, for the two were close all their lives. The king did not single out Christiane for cruelty. The system simply did what the system did, weighing dynasties and ranks and protocols, and in its cold calculations, the love of an elder sister for a travelling duke counted for nothing at all. Christiane was asked to give up the one great happiness of her years, so that the greater interests of her family and her sister's crown could be served, and she lent it up. That renunciation, made in her 20s and lived out over the whole of her long remaining life, is the true centre of her tale, and it is to the living out of it, to the long still years that followed, that we now turn. In the late summer of 1761, the time came for Charlotte to leave, and with her leaving the two of them of Miro were parted, and the elder was left behind to begin the long still aftermath of her broken hopes. The escort sent by the British king arrived to carry the 17-year-old bride away to England, and the family gathered to make their farewells to the youngest daughter, who was going off to become a queen beyond the sea. For the whole house it was a moment of mingled triumph and grief, pride in the dazzling fortune that had fallen on the little sister, and sorrow at the parting. For everyone understood that Charlotte was leaving not for a season, but in all likelihood forever, passing out of the small German world entirely, and into a foreign court from which she might never return. The brothers, the household, the familiar rooms, the lake, the whole quiet country of their childhood, all of it the bride was leaving behind, and the family she was leaving stood on the shore of their old life and watched her go. But for Christiane, the parting carried a double weight that no one else quite shared. She was losing her sister, the little girl she had helped to raise, the beloved younger sibling with whom she had in common the whole of her childhood, and she was losing her sister in the very same season, almost the very same weeks, in which she was also losing her duke, her one love, her own hoped-for marriage. The two losses fell together, bound up in the same event, for it was Charlotte's marriage that was both carrying the sibling away and forbidding the elder's own. Christiane stood on the threshold of her sister's glory and her own desolation at once, watching the younger girl sail off to a throne while she herself remained behind, her engagement broken, her future emptied of the happiness it had so nearly held. If ever a moment held the whole cruel symmetry of their two lives in a single image, it was this, the elder watching the younger depart for a crown, knowing that the crown was the very thing that had cost her the desire of her own heart. We have no record of what passed between the pair of them in those last days at Miro, no account of their final embraces or their parting words. But we know the depth of the bond between them, and we can imagine something of what that leaving must have held. Surely there was love in it, and grief at the deep sorrow of two sisters being torn apart who might never meet again. Whether there was any shadow of resentment in Christiane's heart, any bitterness toward the sister whose triumph had cost her so much, we cannot know, and everything we know of her character and of the love between them suggests that if such feelings stirred, she mastered them. For the bond between the sisters survived the parting, survived even the cruel symmetry of their fates, and would be kept alive for the rest of their lives through devoted correspondence over the sea. Whatever Christiane felt as she watched her sister go, she did not let it poison the love between them. She let her sister sail to her crown, and she kept her sister in her heart, and she turned to face the long, tranquil years that now stretched before her. And what a contrast that life would be to the one her sister was sailing toward. Charlotte was bound for England, for palaces and ceremonies and a throne, for a marriage and a profound family and a standing at the very centre of the world's affairs, her every doing henceforth recorded, her name to be carried down the centuries. Christiane was staying in the little duchy, in the quiet country of her childhood, her engagement broken, her own marriage forbidden, her years turning inward toward the modest round of the German courts and the service of her family. The youngest was rising into history. The elder was settling into obscurity. They had started from exactly the same place, the same modest castle, the same modest prospects, and now their paths diverged so violently that one would be a queen remembered for centuries, and the second a princess the world would almost entirely forget. The leaving at Miro was the moment that divergence became true and final, the last time, perhaps, that the two girls stood together in their childhood home before the sea, and their separate fates came between them. So Charlotte sailed, and Christiane stayed, and the door that had opened so wonderfully onto the firstborn's happiness was now firmly and finally shut. There would be no marriage to the Duke, no life in the wider world, no partnership of the heart with the man she loved. There would instead be the long tranquil years in the modest duchy, the dignified but solitary existence of an unmarried princess, the service of her family, the keeping of her devotion, and the loyal correspondence with the distant sister whose crown had shaped both their fates. It was not the life Christiane had hoped for in that one bright season of her courtship, but it was the existence she was given, and she would live it, as she did everything, with patience and stateliness and a hushed strength that asked for no pity and made no complaint. To see what she made of that life, the long aftermath of her renunciation, we turn now to the decades that followed her sister's leaving, and to the first great question that faced her, the question of whether she would ever marry at all. It is worth pausing here, with Charlotte newly sailed away to England, to look at the world the younger had gone to, the great glittering foreign court that now received her, for it was the world that Christiane would know only through letters, the distant, brilliant life of the sister she had lost to the sea. And the contrast between that world and the quiet German one Christiane kept to is the very measure of how far the two of them fates had diverged. Charlotte had gone to be queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth, mistress of palaces, wife of a king, at the very centre of the world's affairs. Christiane remained in the small duchy of their childhood, the lady of a provincial court, unknown to the wide world. The same nursery had produced them both, and now one was a queen in England, and the other a spinster princess in Germany, and the letters that crossed the sea between them carried news of two lives that could hardly have been more different. Consider the England that Charlotte sailed into. It was a kingdom at the height of its confidence and its power, a rising empire, rich and proud and bustling, its capital one of the great cities of the world, its court grand and ceremonious in ways the small German courts could scarcely imagine. Charlotte married into all of it, into the palaces and the ceremonies and the vast apparatus of a deep monarchy, and she had to make her way, a foreign girl of 17, in a court that was proud and insular and quick to find her plain and provincial. The early days were hard for her, as we have noted in passing, lonely and difficult. the language a mighty barrier, the homesickness sharp, a watchful mother-in-law making her path harder still. And we may ask to whom the lonely young queen turned in those bleak early years for the comfort of familiar affection. To her family beyond the sea, and among them surely to the elder who had helped to raise her, the steady tender presence of her childhood now distant but not forgotten. So the letters that ran between the sisters in those early years carried, from England, the homesickness and the loneliness of a young queen finding her feet in a cold court, and carried from Germany, we may suppose, the comfort and the counsel of the firstborn who knew her so well. There is a poignancy in imagining it, the queen in her grand foreign palace, surrounded by every splendour, and yet desperately homesick, pouring out her heart in letters to the sister in the quiet German duchy, and the sister reading those letters in the familiar rooms of home, grieving for the younger one's loneliness, even as she lived out her own quieter sorrow. Each had her burden, the queen her gilded loneliness, and the princess her renounced love, and through the sea they shared them, the bond of their childhood proving stronger than the vast difference of their stations. In time, of course, Charlotte's life in England settled and even flourished. The lonely young queen grew into her position, mastered the language, made her peace with the court, and found, in her marriage and her family, a true and lasting happiness. She bore a great many children, filled the royal nurseries, became the matriarch of a vast royal brood, the mother of future kings. She built with her husband a court of domestic virtue that remade the very image of the monarchy. She pursued her passions, her music, and above all her botany, becoming a patron of the arts and sciences, her name attached in time to a brilliant flower and a magnificent garden. It was a full and significant life, lived in the full glare of history, and Christiane followed it all from afar, through the constant letters, watching her little sister's life unfold in its foreign splendour, sharing in its joys and its sorrows over the distance, the elder keeping steadfast track of the younger one's great career from the hush of the German court. And we should let that contrast stand, for it is the heart of the sisters' double story. Charlotte's life was the public one, the recorded one, the life of palaces and crowns and children and fame, the life history remembers. Christiane's was the private one, the quiet one, the life of a provincial court and a renounced love and a devoted obscurity, the life history forgets. But they were sisters still, bound by the love of their shared childhood, and the letters ran between them through all that time and all the difference, joining the two lives, the brilliant and the quiet, into a single story of sisterly devotion. When we remember Charlotte, the famous queen, we should remember too the firstborn in Germany who loved her and followed her career from afar and kept faith with her through the sea. And when we tell Christiane's quiet story, we should remember that it was lived always against the background of her sister's brilliant one, the two of them joined through everything by the unbroken thread of their correspondence and their love. Here we come to the quiet fact that, more than any other, defines the rest of Christiane's life, and that gives her history its lasting tenderness. After the breaking of her engagement to the Duke of Roxburgh, Christiane never married. Not then, not later, not ever. She lived out the whole of her long remaining life, more than 30 years of it, as an unmarried woman, and she went to her grave a spinster, the princess who had loved once and lost and never loved again, or at least never married again. And here is the detail that turns a sad story into something almost unbearably poignant, the detail that lifts it out of mere misfortune and into a kind of quiet faithfulness on both sides. The Duke of Roxburgh never married either. He too lived out his whole existence unwed, the man who had loved Christiane and been forbidden to marry her remaining, like her, single to the end of his days. Think about what that means. Two people, parted not by any failing of their own, but by the brute force of protocol and politics. Each refused the other, and each then refused everyone else for the rest of their lives. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for either of them to move on, to make another match, to find some other suitable partner and build a life. Roxburgh was a profound nobleman of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, rich and cultivated and eligible, who could have had his pick of brides. Christiane was a princess, sister to a queen, who might in time have been matched with some other prince of the German courts. The pressures and the opportunities to marry elsewhere must have been considerable for both of them, and yet neither did. Both of them, having been denied the one they loved, chose to remain alone rather than marry another. It is the kind of quiet, lifelong faithfulness that we associate with the profound love stories, except that this one had no happy ending, no reunion, no final coming together. There was only the parting, and then two lives lived separately, in two different countries, each kept solitary by a love that had been forbidden and never replaced. We should be careful here, of course, for the historical record is thin, and we cannot read the inmost hearts of two people dead these many centuries. It is possible that there were other reasons, other circumstances, that kept each of them unmarried, considerations we cannot now recover. The past does not always give up its full explanations, but the bare facts are striking enough on their own, and they speak with a still eloquence. Two people loved, were forbidden to marry, and then neither ever married anyone. Whatever the full story behind that double solitude, it has the shape of a lifelong fidelity, two hearts that, having been denied one another, would settle for no one else. And there is something deeply moving in the symmetry of it. The Duke in his great house in Scotland, and the Princess in her small duchy in Germany, separated by the sea and by the protocols that had parted them, each living out a lengthy unmarried life, each, perhaps, never quite forgetting the bright season when they had hoped to share a life together. For Christiane, the choice to remain unmarried, whether it was wholly a choice or partly a circumstance, set the entire course of her final years. An unmarried princess of the 18th century did not simply fade away into nothing. However, there were respectable and even dignified paths open to a woman of her rank who did not wed ways of living that gave such women a footing and a function and a measure of independence. Christiane would walk those paths, and walk them with grace. She would find a genuine role in the service of her family, as the companion and helpmeet of her unmarried brother. She would receive honours and distinctions in her own right that marked her as a person of consequence. She would build, out of the wreckage of her hoped-for marriage, a life that was quiet but not empty, solitary but not without composure or purpose. The renunciation of marriage was not the end of her tale, but the beginning of its long second act, the act in which she made, out of what she had been left, a life worth living. But we should not let the self-possession of that later life soften too much the loss at the heart of it. Christiane gave up love and marriage, the central goods of a woman's life in that age and perhaps in any age, the partnership and the family and the home of her own that she had so nearly had. She gave them up not by her own choice but at the command of forces beyond her, and she gave them up so that her sister's crown might sit easily. And then she lived more than 30 years in the shadow of that loss, never marrying, never having the husband and children she might have had, watching from her tranquil duchy as her sister filled the nurseries of England with a deep royal family. That devotionfulness was beautiful, but it was also an extended sorrow, a lifetime lived in the absence of the thing most desired. That she bore it with such patience and built upon it such a dignified life is the measure of her character. But the loss was real, and it lasted all her days, and we do her no honour if we forget it. One of the paths open to an unmarried noblewoman of the German lands, and one that Christiane took, was that of the canoness, and it is worth understanding this curious and now almost forgotten institution, for it gave women like her a place in the world that was respectable, dignified, and surprisingly independent. To modern ears, the word canoness might suggest a nun, a woman shut away in a convent under vows of poverty and obedience, but that is not at all what it meant in Christiane's world, at least not in the Protestant houses of Germany. The canoness of an imperial abbey was something quite different and rather remarkable, a kind of dignified position for an unmarried lady of rank, carrying honour and often income, and a true measure of personal freedom, without requiring her to renounce the world or take permanent religious vows, or even, in many cases, to live within the abbey at all. These institutions had their roots deep in the Middle Ages, the great religious houses for women that had dotted the German lands. But in the Protestant territories after the Reformation, many of them had been transformed into something new. They became, in effect, dignified establishments for the unmarried daughters of the nobility, foundations where a lady of suitable rank could hold a place, draw an income, and enjoy a respected and independent status. A canoness of such a foundation was a woman of standing, her position, a mark of her noble birth and a provision for her maintenance, and crucially she was not bound by the strict vows of a true nun. She could often live where she pleased, could leave the foundation and even marry if a suitable match arose, and held her standing as a kind of honourable sinecure rather than a religious imprisonment. It was, in short, an elegant solution to a genuine social problem, the problem of what to do with the unmarried daughters of noble houses, and it gave such women a poise and an independence that they might otherwise have lacked entirely. Christiane was made a canoness of one of these ancient foundations, a great imperial abbey that had become, like others of its kind, an establishment for noble ladies. It was a mark of her rank, and a provision for her standing, a recognition of her position as a princess of a ruling house, and it gave her an honourable status in her own right, independent of any marriage. And yet characteristically, Christiane did not actually take up residence at the abbey. She held the position and the honour of a canoness, but she continued to live where her heart and her duty lay, with her brother, in the duchy that was her home. The canonry was a stateliness she carried, a title and a standing, and perhaps an income, but it did not pull her away from her family. She remained, in her daily round, the sister and companion of her brother the Duke, while holding, in name and in honour, the respected position of a canoness of an imperial foundation. There is something fitting in this arrangement, this holding of a dignified independent status, while choosing nonetheless to remain close to her family. It captures something of the whole shape of Christiane's life, the composure without the display, the honour quietly held rather than loudly enjoyed, the personal independence subordinated, always, to the bonds of family and the call of duty. She could have used her canonry to live an independent life apart, but she chose instead to keep to her brother and her home, to remain the steady elder presence in the family she had served since childhood. The canoness's position gave her a standing in the world that did not depend on a husband, a place and a self-possession that were hers in her own right, and that mattered for a woman who had been denied the marriage that would ordinarily have defined her. But she wore that independent poise lightly, and she did not let it carry her away from the people and the place she loved. Yeah, for a woman in Christiane's position, denied marriage and the establishment it would have brought, the canonry was a true and valuable thing, a way of being someone in the world, of having a recognised place and an honourable standing, of not simply vanishing into the shadows as a dependent spinster. It is one of the quiet provisions that the old order made for women like her, and it deserves to be remembered, for it tells us that the unmarried noblewoman of that age was not always a figure of pity and dependence, but could hold real stateliness and real independence through these curious surviving institutions. Christiana, the sister of a queen, the princess who had loved and lost, found in the canonry one of the supports of her middle and later days, a mark of honour and a measure of standing that were hers alone. It was not the marriage she had hoped for, not the partnership of the heart she had so nearly had, but it was a dignity and a place, and she held it with the same quiet grace she brought to everything, the learned elder sister making, out of the materials her world offered her, years of genuine if unshowy worth. In the January of 1766, some years after her sister had become Queen of Great Britain, Christiane received an honour that marked her, in her own right, and quite apart from her famous sister, as a personage of European consequence. The Empress Catherine II of Russia, the formidable woman whom history remembers as Catherine the Great, bestowed upon Christiane the Order of St. Catherine, one of the highest distinctions that the Russian crown could confer upon a woman, and Christiane became a dame of that order, entitled to wear its badge and star and ribbon, the red sash and the jewelled insignia that proclaimed her one of the honoured ladies of Europe. We see her wearing them in the portraits that survive, the badge and the star and the broad red ribbon of the Russian order, the marks of a distinction granted to her by one of the most powerful sovereigns in the world. The Order of St. Catherine was a particular and prestigious thing, an honour created in Russia for women of high rank, bestowed sparingly and as a mark of true distinction. It had been founded earlier in the century by the great reforming Tsar Peter I, who established it in honour of his own wife, and it had become the principal Russian distinction reserved for women, conferred upon empresses and grand duchesses and the most eminent noble ladies of Russia, and, on rarer occasions, upon princesses of the wider European houses whom the Russian crown wished to honour. To receive it was to be drawn into a small and exalted company of the most distinguished women of the age, and for a princess of an obscure German duchy to be admitted to that company was a notable thing indeed, a sign that her standing reached well beyond the modest bounds of her own small state. To be made a dame of it was to be recognized among the great ladies of the continent, to be drawn into the network of honour and precedence that bound the courts of Europe together at their highest levels. For Christiane, the princess of an obscure German duchy, it was a considerable mark of standing, and it is worth pausing over what it tells us. It tells us first that she was a person of recognised consequence in her own right, not merely the shadowy elder sister of a famous queen, but a princess whose rank and standing were acknowledged at the highest levels of European society, honoured by an empress. And it tells us too something of how the elevation of her family, the very elevation that had cost her so dearly, had also raised the standing of all its members, so that the sister of the Queen of Great Britain was a figure of note in the courts of Europe, worthy of the attention of even the great Catherine of Russia. There is a certain bitter sweetness in the honour when we set it against the loss that had preceded it. The Order of St. Catherine gave Christiane prestige, recognition, a place among the honoured ladies of Europe. But it could not give her back the thing she had lost, the marriage and the love and the life of her own that had been forbidden her. She had the badge and the star and the broad red ribbon, the marks of a great distinction. She did not have the husband she had loved or the family she might have raised. The honour was real, and it was considerable, and she surely valued it. But it was, in a sense, the kind of thing the world gives to those it is already deprived of the deeper goods, the consolation prize of rank and recognition offered to a woman denied the ordinary happiness of a home of her own. She wore the red ribbon of the Empress's order, the learned princess of the small duchy, and beneath the honour lay the quiet, long sorrow of the love she had given up. And yet we should not be too quick to read the honour as mere consolation, for it meant something genuine, and it gave Christiane a real standing in the world that mattered. To be a person of consequence in her own right, recognised and honoured across Europe, was no small thing. for a woman who might otherwise have been merely a dependent spinster sister, overshadowed entirely by her royal sibling. The Order of St. Catherine marked her as someone, gave her a dignity and a distinction that were hers and no one else's, and that recognition, in a life that had been so shaped by loss and renunciation, was surely a thing of genuine value. She had been denied the marriage that would ordinarily have defined a woman's place, but she had not been denied all standing, all recognition, all consequence. She was a dame of one of the great orders of Europe, honoured by an empress, a princess of acknowledged rank, and that was a kind of compensation, however incomplete, for the path she had not been allowed to have. The honour also reminds us of something easy to forget when we tell Christiane's story chiefly as a tale of loss, that her days was not only the negative thing, the marriage that did not happen, but had its own positive content, its own distinctions and dignities and quiet achievements. She was a canoness of an imperial foundation. She was a dame of the Order of St. Catherine. She was the trusted companion and representative of her brother the Duke, with a real function in the small state's life. She was a woman of learning and cultivation, of recognised rank and European consequence. These were not nothing. They were the materials out of which she built a life that was, for all its central sorrow, an existence of dignity and standing and purpose. The child from the little castle by the lake, denied the love she had hoped for, did not simply collapse into a shadowed and pitiable spinsterhood. She made of her diminished prospects a span of true worth, honoured by the great, useful to her family, rich in the inner cultivation of a learned mind. And the red ribbon of Catherine's order, glowing in her portraits, is one of the marks of that quiet, dignified, hard-won life. We have spoken of Christiane's losses and her renunciations, and it would be easy to leave the impression of a life defined wholly by what it lacked, but that would be to miss something important, for she had within her resources that sustained her through the long, unhurried years, and chief among them were her belief and her erudition, the two great consolations of her inner world. To understand how a woman could bear what she bore, the broken engagement, the forbidden marriage, the long single life, the deaths of those she loved, and bear it without bitterness and without despair, we have to understand the inner supports that held her up, the deep wells she drew upon when the outer world had taken so much from her. The first of these was her religion, the deep and unshowy faith that she had imbibed in the pious household of her childhood, and that remained the steady centre of her character all her days. The family at Miro had been devout, the day framed by prayer and the week by worship, and the religion they instilled was no mere formality but a living thing, a real trust in providence, a genuine submission to the will of God, a deep conviction that ran beneath all the surface events of mortal existence. For a woman schooled in that faith, the losses and disappointments of the world took on a different aspect, became not meaningless cruelties to be raged against, but trials to be borne, part of a providence whose purposes were beyond human sight. We have no record of Christiane's private devotions, no diary of her spiritual life, but we know that devotion she was raised in, and the steadiness with which she bore her sorrows, and we may be sure that her religion was among the deepest sources of that steadiness, the rock on which she stood when so much else had been taken away. The second great consolation was her studies, the cultivated mind we have already marked, the Latin and the Greek, and the love of books that set her apart. A woman with such resources is never wholly alone, even in the quietest of lives, for she has the whole company of the written word to draw upon, the philosophers and the poets and the historians, the great voices of the past that speak to anyone who can read them. Through the long still years at Strelitz, in the spaces left by a life that had been emptied of so much, Christiane had her books, her studies, the rich inner kingdom of a furnished and disciplined mind. We do not know the particular authors she loved or the studies she pursued, but we know she had the keys to that kingdom, and it is pleasant and surely right to imagine that she found in it a deep and lasting solace. The company of the great minds of the ages filling the rooms that love and marriage had been forbidden to fill. Together, the religion and the learning made an inner course of real richness, a furnished and sustained interior world that no external loss could reach. This is something easy to overlook when we tell a story chiefly in terms of outward events. The marriages made and unmade, the honours given, the deaths suffered. But a human life is lived as much within as without, and the inner self can be rich where the outer is poor, can be full where the outer is empty. Christiane's outer life, after her great renunciation, was quiet and contained and marked by absence, the absence of the husband and the children and the home of her own that she might have had. But her inner world, we have every reason to believe, was deep and sustained, anchored in a living faith, and enriched by a cultivated mind. And it was this inner life that carried her, with such grace, through the long span of her sequestered existence. There is a kind of freedom in that even, a freedom the world rarely credits. The woman who has been denied the ordinary goods of her days, the marriage and the family and the establishment, is also in a sense released from the ordinary cares and bondages of those goods, free to cultivate the inner life in a way that the busy and the fulfilled rarely can. Christiane had time and quiet, and her books and her religion, and a settled position that asked of her only her dignity and her service. It is not the existence she would have chosen, had the choice been hers, but it was a life with its own compensations, its own depths, its own quiet riches, and we should not pity her too simply, as though her existence were merely empty. It was not empty. It was filled, in its quiet way, with the things of the mind and the spirit, the faith that gave it meaning, and the learning that gave it company. And a woman so sustained can bear a great deal of outer loss and remain within, unbroken. Christiane bore her losses and remained unbroken, and the faith and the learning were the secret of it, the deep inner supports of her long and dignified and quietly rich existence. The great fact of Christiane's everyday existence, across the decades that followed her sister's leaving, was her partnership with her brother Adolphus, the reigning duke at the court of Neustrelitz. For Adolphus Frederick, who had become duke as a young man after their father's death, never married, just as his eldest sister never married, and the two unwed siblings made their life together, the bachelor duke and the spinster princess, sharing the duchy's quiet court between them. Christiane lived with her brother Neustrelitz, the seat of the Dukes of Strelitz, and she became in effect the lady of his court, the woman who presided over his household, and stood at his side and represented him when he could not be present himself. It was a real position and a real partnership, and it gave Christiane, for all those days of her final decades, a function and a place and a purpose. Neustrelitz was itself a curious and rather charming place, a planned town laid out in a neat geometric pattern around the ducal residence, a small capital for a small state, orderly and quiet and provincial. There the two siblings kept their modest court, the duke ruling his little duchy and the princess's sister managing the domestic life around him, and there Christiane spent the great body of her adult years. Picture the shape of that life. A small North German court, sober and well-ordered, far from the glittering capitals of Europe. A bachelor duke and his unmarried sister at its head, the two of them grown old together in harness, sharing the quiet round of a small state's affairs. The princess, learned and dignified and capable, running the household she had been trained from girlhood to run, presiding over the court's modest ceremonies, acting as her brother's hostess and helpmeet and deputy. It was years of duty and order and quiet usefulness, lived out in the same small German world she had always known. The role of acting as her brother's representative was no mere formality. When the Duke could not be present at some function, or when the business of the court required a figure of rank to stand in his place, it was Christiane who did so, deputizing for the sovereign, representing the ducal house, carrying the dignity of the family on those occasions when her brother could not. It was the kind of function that an unmarried sister of a bachelor ruler naturally fell into, the lady of the court who stood in for the absent or unmarried prince, and Christiane filled it with the competence and the dignity that a whole upbringing had prepared her for. The training her mother had given her, decades before, in the running of a household and the management of a court, now found its full use as the eldest daughter of Miro became the presiding lady of Neustrelitz, her brother's right hand through the decades of his reign. There is a tranquil contentment to be imagined in this life, for all that it was not the life Christiane had hoped for in her one bright season of love. She was not alone. She had her brother, the companion of her childhood, with whom she shared her home and her days. She had a real function and a real place, a dignity and an usefulness that gave shape and meaning to her years. She had her scholarship and her books, her inner kingdom of the mind. She had her honours, her canonry and her order, the marks of her standing in the world. And she had, across the sea, the loyal correspondence with her sister, the thread of love that bound her to Charlotte through all that time of their separation. It was a contained life, a small life by the measure of her sister's, lived out in a sequestered provincial court in an obscure German duchy. But it was not an empty life, and it was not, one hopes, an unhappy one. There can be a deep peace in an existence of duty and order and family, lived close to home among familiar things, and Christiane, with her patient, dutiful temperament, may well have found such a peace in the long Neustrelitz years, and yet the central absence remained beneath all the dignity and all the usefulness and all the quiet contentment. Christiane kept house for her brother because she had no house of her own, no husband, no children. She presided over his court because she had no court of her own to preside over. She was the lady of Neustrelitz, the Duke's sister and deputy, precisely because she had never been allowed to become the Duchess of Roxburghe, the wife and partner she had hoped to be. The path she built at Neustrelitz was a fine and dignified life, but it was, in a sense, a life built in the space left by the existence she had not been allowed to have, and making do, however graceful, with the materials left after the grievous loss. She served her brother's household because the household of her own had been forbidden her. There is no bitterness in the record, no sign that she resented her lot or railed against her fate. But the shape of her days tells its own quiet story, the history of a woman who poured into her family the love and the care and the devotion that she might have poured into a family of her own, and who found, in the service of her brother and the keeping of his court, a place to stand in a world that had denied her the place she most desired. Let us try to picture an ordinary day in Christiane's long Neustrelitz years, for the texture of her daily round, quiet and unrecorded as it was, is worth imagining. The round of an existence lived out in the small ordered court of the duchy. Neustrelitz, as we have noted, was a planned town, laid out in a neat geometric pattern around the ducal residence, a model of orderly provincial design, the streets radiating from a central square, the whole little capital arranged with a tidy symmetry. It was a small and quiet place, this seat of the Dukes of Strelitz, far from the noise and bustle of the great cities, a sober North German town going about its modest business under the wide pale sky. And there, in the ducal residence at the heart of it, the bachelor duke and his unmarried sister kept their court and lived their ordered days. Ugh. The day in such a court would have had its settled shape, governed by the rhythms of a small ordered household and the duties of a hushed ruling family. There would have been the devotions, for the piety of the Miro childhood carried into the New Strelitz years, the day framed by prayer as it had been in the castle of their youth. There would have been the business of the court, such as it was, the affairs of a small duchy, the audiences and the correspondence and the modest ceremonies of a provincial sovereign, in much of which Christiane would have had her part, as her brother's hostess and helpmeet, and sometime deputy. There would have been the management of the household, the domestic ordering of the ducal residence, the work that Christiane had been trained from girlhood to do, and that gave her days their function and their purpose. And there would have been, in the quieter hours, her own pursuits, her reading and her studies, her correspondence with her distant sister, the private occupations of a cultivated and solitary woman. It was not a glamorous life, and it left no record, no diary of its daily doings, no letters describing its ordinary round. But it was not, we may believe, an unhappy life, for it had its order and its dignity and its quiet satisfactions. Christiane was not idle, not merely a dependent spinster passing empty days. She had a real function in her brother's court, a recognized place, a useful role. She had her honours, her canonry, and her order, the marks of her standing. She had her inner life, her devotion and her erudition. She had her correspondence with Charlotte, the thread of love across the sea. And she had the deep familiarity of a life lived among her own people, in her own country, close to the things she knew and loved. There can be a real contentment in such a life, a quiet peace in the ordered round of duty and devotion and familiar occupation, and Christiane, with her patient temperament and her deep faith, may well have found it. We should resist, in fact, the temptation to paint her declining days in colours of unrelieved sadness, as though the loss of her love had condemned her to a span of misery. There is no evidence of that. The evidence, such as it is, suggests a woman who bore her lot with dignity and made of it years of real worth, who served her family faithfully, held her honours gracefully, and went about her unhurried existence without complaint. The sorrow at the centre of her history, the renounced love, the forbidden marriage, was genuine and lasting, and we should not minimize it. But it did not swallow her whole. Around it she built a life of order and dignity and quiet usefulness, and she lived that life across the long Neustrelitz years with the same steady grace she brought to everything. The day at Neustrelitz, ordinary and unrecorded, was the daily form of that calm, dignified life, the round of devotion and duty and familiar occupation in which Christiane passed the great body of her later days. And there were the brother and sister, growing old together through all those years, the two unmarried siblings who had made their life in harness. There is something touching in that long companionship, the bachelor duke and the spinster princess, sharing their home and their days and their quiet court across the decades, each the other's chief companion, each grown old in the other's presence. They were not husband and wife, but they were partners of a kind, bound by blood and by the long sharing of a life, and the daily round at Neustrelitz was the round of their shared existence, that the two of them at the head of their small ordered court, going about the business of the duchy and the household together. When at last the brother died, and Christiane was left alone in her old age, it was the breaking of that long companionship, the end of the shared life that had given her final decades their shape and their centre. But for the many decades before that breaking, the brother and sister had their life together at Neustrelitz, the quiet ordered, dignified life of the duchy's bachelor duke and his constant unmarried sister, and it was, for all its quietness, an existence of real substance and real worth. We have followed Christiane's bonds with her mother and her sister, but there were the brothers too, and the wider family, and her footing among them was one of the steady supports of the whole of her years, for she was a woman deeply embedded in her family, and her devotion to it was perhaps the truest theme of her existence. Of the surviving children of Miro, several were brothers, and they grew up alongside Christiane and Charlotte in the crowded nursery of their childhood, the sons of the house with whom the daughters shared the first years. 2 of these brothers would rule the duchy in their turn, and both would matter greatly to Christiane across her course. There was Adolphus Frederick, the eldest brother, who became duke as a young man, and with whom Christiane would share the long Neustrelitz years, the bachelor brother and the spinster sister grown old together. And there was Charles, another brother, who would in his own turn succeed to the duchy and rule it after Adolphus. The bond among these siblings was, by every sign, a strong and lasting one, the close solidarity of a family that had weathered together the losses of childhood and the vast changes of their fortunes. They had buried their father young, watched their mother govern as regent, seen their family lifted from obscurity to alliance with a great throne, and through all of it they had held together, the surviving children of Miro, bound by the shared experience of their remarkable common history. It is worth remembering that there survives a small and charming token of that family solidarity, a snuff box made in those days of their middle life, on which the whole family is depicted together, the Queen and her sister, and their brothers and a sister-in-law, gathered in a single image, a kind of family portrait in miniature. It is a touching little thing, that snuff box, a sign that even across the distances that fortune had put between them, the family of Miro thought of itself as one, and liked to picture itself together, the scattered children of the small duchy assembled, at least in an image, as the family they had always been. Christiane's particular role in this family was the role she had played since childhood, the eldest daughter, the steady presence, the one who served. Her devotion to her brother Adolphus, with whom she shared her home and her middle and declining days, was the central fact of her daily existence, as we have seen. But her care reached out to the whole family, to the brothers and their concerns, to the wider network of the House of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, to which she gave the loyalty and the service that she might have given to a family of her own. She was, in a sense, the family's steadfast spinster, the unmarried daughter who poured into the service of her relations the love and care that marriage would have directed elsewhere, a figure familiar in every age, the devoted maiden aunt and sister who holds a family together with her quiet, unregarded faithfulness. It was not the role she had hoped for in her one bright season of love, but it was a true and valuable role, and she filled it with all her heart. There is a particular pathos in the contrast between Christiane's childlessness and the great fertility of her royal sister. While Charlotte across the sea was filling the nurseries of England with a vast brood of children, 15 in all, Christiane in her German duchy had none, no children of her own to love and raise and watch grow, and yet she was not without young ones in her years, for the family was large, and the next generation came along, the children of her brothers, the nieces and nephews of the House of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. To these young relations Christiane could be the loving aunt, pouring into them something of the maternal tenderness that had no children of her own to receive it. The eldest sister who had helped to raise her own younger siblings, and above all the little Charlotte, could be, in her later days, the devoted aunt to the new generation, the unmarried elder of the family, taking the young ones to her heart. And among those young relations was one who would rise to a fame and a love that rivaled even Charlotte's own, a niece whose story deserves its own place in Christiane's, for it shows once more how the daughters of the small, obscure duchy could be lifted to extraordinary heights. The blood of Miro, it seemed, was destined to flow into the great thrones of Europe, and not only through Charlotte, The next generation of the family would produce its own dazzling marriages, its own queens, and Christiane, the childless aunt, would live to see the beginning of one of the most celebrated of all, the rise of a beloved niece toward a throne. It is to those nieces, and to that remarkable niece above all, that we turn next, for they are part of Christiane's family world, the young ones she loved, the next generation of the house she served so faithfully all her years. The most remarkable of all Christiane's nieces, and one whose rise she lived just long enough to see, was a daughter of her brother Charles, a girl named Louise, who would become one of the most beloved figures in all the history of Germany. Louise was born in the 1770s, a daughter of Christiane's brother Charles and his wife, a princess of Hesse-Darmstadt, and she grew up, like the aunts before her, as a princess of the House of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, though by then the family's fortunes and connections had been transformed by Charlotte's English crown. Louise was, by every account, a young woman of extraordinary charm and beauty and goodness, the very type of grace, and she was destined for a marriage and a fame that would make her a national heroine and one of the great women of her age. In the year 1793, just a year before Christiane's death, the young Louise was married to the Crown Prince of Prussia, the heir to one of the rising great powers of Europe, the man who would in time become King Frederick William III. It was a brilliant match, lifting another daughter of the small Mecklenburg house into one of the great royal families of the continent, and it was, unusually for such marriages, a genuine love match as well, the prince and the princess truly devoted to each other. Louise became, in time, Queen of Prussia, and she won the hearts of her people as few queens ever have, beloved for her beauty and her warmth and her goodness, a figure of grace and dignity, who would face the darkest hour of her country's history with a courage that made her a legend. When the armies of Napoleon overran Prussia and brought the kingdom to its knees, it was Queen Louise who came to embody the suffering and the dignity and the eventual hope of her people, standing with a famous courage against the conqueror, and her early death only deepened the love her people bore her, so that she passed into German memory as a kind of saint of the nation, mourned and revered for generations. Now Christiane did not live to see most of this, for she perished in 1794, when Louise was still a young bride newly married into Prussia, before the great drama of the Napoleonic years and the niece's tragic heroism had unfolded. But she lived just long enough to see the beginning of it, to see her young niece married to the heir of Prussia, lifted toward a throne, embarked on the path that would make her immortal. And there is a poignancy in that, the aunt at the end of her own still existence witnessing the dawn of her niece's brilliant one, the childless spinster who had given up her own marriage, seeing the young woman of the next generation make exactly the kind of love match, crowned with a throne, that had been denied to Christiane herself. One wonders what passed through Christiane's heart as she watched her beautiful young niece marry her prince in love and rise toward a great destiny, whether there was joy in it untouched by any shadow, or whether the sight of the young one's happiness stirred some quiet echo of her own lost hopes. We cannot know, but the contrast is striking. The aunt who had loved and lost and never married, watching the niece who loved and married and rose to glory, the two generations of the same small house, the same blood, and such different fates. The rise of Louise was not the only such marriage among the nieces, for the daughters of Christiane's brother made their way into the great houses of Germany, the blood of Mecklenburg-Strelitz flowing on into the next generation of European royalty. The small obscure duchy that had produced, in one generation, a Queen of Great Britain, produced in the next a Queen of Prussia, and others besides. Its daughters carried up again and again into the great thrones and noble houses of the continent. It was a remarkable record for so small and poor a state, and it speaks to something in the family some quality of grace and goodness and suitability that made its daughters sought-after brides for the greatest of matches. Christiane stood, in a sense, at the heart of that family, the unmarried aunt who never rose herself, but who belonged to the house whose daughters rose so high, the queens of Britain and Prussia among them. Okay. And so the childless spinster of the small duchy was, after all, surrounded by greatness, the sister of one queen and the aunt of another, belonging to a family whose daughters wore the crowns of powerful kingdoms, even as she herself wore none. There is something both poignant and fitting in that. The woman who had given up her own marriage and her own children, living at the centre of a family so blessed in its marriages and its children, loving the nieces who rose to the heights she had been denied, devoted to the last to the house whose glory she shared without herself partaking of it. The blood of Miro ran into the thrones of Europe, and Christiane was of that blood, the quiet, loyal aunt at the heart of the rising house, watching her family climb to heights she would never reach herself, and loving them, we may be sure, with the whole of her generous, undivided heart. Across all the many decades of separation, the bond between the pair of them endured, kept alive by the constant exchange of letters across the sea, and that correspondence is one of the most touching threads of Christiane's whole story. When Charlotte sailed away to England in 1761, the sisters were parted in body, the one in her glittering English court, the other in her tranquil German duchy, separated by the breadth of the North Sea and by the vast difference of their stations. But they were not parted in affection, and they found in letters the means to keep their sisterly love alive across the distance. Through the decades that followed, the Queen in England and the Princess in Germany wrote to each other, maintaining over all those miles the bond that had been forged in the nursery at Miro, two sisters who refused to let an ocean and a crown come between their hearts. We know from Charlotte's side how much such correspondence meant to her, for the Queen, in her early lonely years in England, poured out her homesickness and her frustration in letters home, finding in the writing to her German family a precious link to the world she had left behind. The lonely young queen, struggling with a foreign language and a cold court and a watchful mother-in-law, turned to her family across the sea for the comfort of familiar affection, and her sister Christiane was among the dearest of those distant correspondents. Across the decades, as Charlotte's life filled with children and duties and the long business of being a queen, and as Christiane settled into the quiet round of the Neustrelitz court, the two of them kept up their exchange, sharing their news and their joys and their sorrows, the great events of the Queen's crowded life, and the smaller doings of the Princess's quiet one, bound together still by the letters that crossed and recrossed the sea. There is something especially moving in this correspondence when you remember the cruel symmetry that had divided the sisters' fates. For it was Charlotte's marriage that had cost Christiane her own, the youngest's crown that had forbidden the elder sister's love. If ever there were grounds for a coolness between sisters, for resentment on the one side or guilt on the other, surely this was such a case. And yet the correspondence tells us that no such coolness came between them, or that if it did, the love was stronger than the grievance. The two girls went on loving each other, went on writing to each other, went on sharing their lives across the distance, the Queen and the one left behind, neither letting the strange cruelty of their fates poison the bond between them. Christiane, who had every reason to nurse a wound, seems to have nursed instead the love, keeping her sister in her heart and her correspondence faithful through all that time of their separation. Imagine the two of them at their writing desks, the Queen in her English palace and the Princess in her German court, each setting down for the other the news of her separate world. From England would come the tidings of the great royal family, the births of the many children, the doings of the court, the joys and the worries of a queen's crowded life, From Germany would come the quieter news of the small duchy, the affairs of their brother's court, the life of the family that remained at home. And beneath the news, in the very fact of the steadfast writing, would run the deeper current of their love, the sisterly affection that had begun in the nursery, and that the letters kept alive across those days. For two women so divided by fortune and distance, the correspondence was the lifeline that held them together, the thread that ran across the sea from the heart of the one to the heart of the other, unbroken through all the decades of their parting. That the bond held so faithfully across such distance and through such a history is the final proof of how deep the love between these sisters ran. It would have been so easy for it to fray, for the Queen, caught up in her great life, to let the correspondence lapse, or for the Princess, nursing her loss, to let resentment cool her affection. But it did not fray. The sisters wrote, and went on writing year after year, decade after decade, keeping faith with the love of their childhood across every barrier that life had raised between them. And when, at the last, the news came that Christiane had died, it was a grief to the Queen across the sea, a genuine and personal sorrow, the loss of the sister with whom she had in common the whole of her existence through all those devoted letters. The correspondence was the living form of their love, and it lasted as long as Christiane herself, the unbroken thread between the two daughters of Miro, the one who became a queen and the one who stayed behind, bound to the end by a sisterly devotion that no crown and no ocean could divide. Let us dwell a little longer on the bond between the two sisters, for it is the deepest thread in Christiane's whole course, and the more one considers it, the more remarkable it appears. Here were two women whose lives diverged about as completely as two lives can, who started from the same small nursery, and ended in worlds so different that they might have been born on different planets. One became the queen of a great empire, the mother of kings, a figure of history whose name would be carried down the centuries. The other remained a spinster princess in an obscure duchy, unmarried, childless, almost entirely forgotten. And yet, across that vast divergence, across the sea that separated them and the difference of station that might have estranged them, the two of them remained, to the end, sisters who loved each other. The bond forged in the nursery at Miro proved stronger than every force that fortune sent to test it. Think of what that bond had to survive. It had to survive the simple fact of separation, the parting at 17 that took Charlotte away to England and left Christiane behind, a parting that meant the sisters would, in all likelihood, never meet again in this life. It had to survive the vast difference of their fates, the dizzying elevation of the one and the quiet obscurity of the other, a difference that might easily have bred envy on the one side or condescension on the other, the kind of distance that wealth and rank so often put between people who were once close. And hardest of all, it had to survive the cruel symmetry that had bound their fates together, the fact that Charlotte's crown was the very thing that had cost Christiane her love, that the younger's great fortune was the direct cause of the elder sister's deep loss. If ever there were grounds for a bitterness to creep in between two sisters, surely this was such a case, and yet no bitterness came, or none that the record shows, and the love endured. It is worth wondering what each sister was to the other across those long divided years. For Charlotte, the elder sister, was surely a link to home, to the world of her childhood, to the self she had been before the crown descended upon her. In the loneliness of her early English years, and through all the crowded decades that followed, Christiane was the keeper of Charlotte's origins, the one who remembered the modest castle by the lake and the nursery they had in common, and the mother who had raised them both, the one who had known Charlotte not as a queen but as a little girl. To write to Christiane was to touch home, to be, for the space of a letter, simply the younger daughter of Miro again among all the grandeur of her English life. And for Christiane, the younger sister was surely a window onto the wider world, a source of pride and of vicarious joy, the little one she had helped to raise now grown to greatness, whose brilliant distant life the elder sister could follow and share in through the loyal letters from the stillness of her German court. There is something especially tender in imagining the two of them growing old, the Queen in England and the Princess in Germany, both of them aging through the same decades, both carrying the memory of the same childhood, bound across the sea by the unbroken correspondence. As the decades passed and their lives unfolded along their separate paths, the one filling with children and the great affairs of a kingdom, the other settling into the quiet round of a provincial court, the letters ran back and forth, carrying the news and the love between them. Two old women in the end, the famous queen and the forgotten princess, who had begun together as little girls in a nursery by a lake, and who kept faith with that beginning across the whole long span of their divided lives. The world saw only the queen, but the queen had a sister far away who loved her and was loved by her, and whom she remembered, we may be sure, as the one who had been there from the very start. And when the end came, when Christiane passed away in 1794, and the news reached Charlotte across the sea at Weymouth, the Queen's grief was the final proof of all that the bond had meant. The court was ordered into mourning, the public mark of a private sorrow, and behind the formal black there was, we may be certain, a true and personal grief, the grief of a woman who had lost the sister of her whole existence, the last great link to the childhood they had shared, the one who had loved her from her infancy and kept faith with her across every distance. The two daughters of Moreau had been parted by the sea and by their fates for more than 30 years, but they had never been parted in heart, and when one of them died, the other mourned her as only a sister can. It is the most human and the most beautiful thing in the whole of Christiane's quiet story, this lifelong sisterly love that outlasted every force that sought to break it, the unbreakable bond between the queen who sailed away and the sister who stayed behind. It is worth turning aside for a moment to follow the later life of the man Christiane had loved and lost, the Duke of Roxburghe, for his story, lived out separately across the sea, has its own quiet poignancy and throws her own into deeper relief. John Kerr, the third Duke of Roxburghe, having been forbidden the marriage he had sought with Christiane, returned in time to his own country and his own great affairs, and he lived a long and distinguished life. But, as we have seen, he never married. The man who had loved the German princess and been refused her remained, like her, single to the end of his days, a great nobleman with no wife and no heir of his own body, living out his years in his ancient house with his books and his collections for company. For books were the great passion of Roxburghe's later life, and in them he found, perhaps, something of the consolation that Christiane found in her own learning and her own quiet pursuits. He became one of the most celebrated book collectors in the history of these islands, a bibliophile of legendary devotion and discernment, who assembled over that time a private library of extraordinary richness, crammed with rare and precious volumes, early printed books and priceless manuscripts gathered with a connoisseur's passion and a great fortune's means. His name would become forever associated with the love of fine and rare books, so much so that when, after his death, his great library was sold, the sale was an event in the cultural life of the nation, and a society of book lovers founded in its wake would carry his name down the generations. The man who could not have the woman he loved poured his devotion instead into the gathering of books, and made of that devotion something that outlasted him and kept his name alive. And here is a detail of real poignancy. Roxburghe became, in his final decades, a personal friend of King George III, Christiane's own brother-in-law, the husband of her sister the Queen. The man who had been forbidden to marry into the family of Mecklenburg-Strelitz who had been parted from Christiane precisely because of her sister's marriage to the British king, ended his days as a valued friend of that very king, rewarded with positions at the British court, moving in the circle of the royal family that had, however unwittingly, cost him his love. Think of the strange closeness of it. The man who had loved the Queen's sister and been denied her spent his later years near the Queen herself, a friend of her husband, a familiar figure at the court that was bound by blood to the woman he had not been allowed to marry. Whether he and Charlotte ever spoke of Christiane, whether the Queen ever looked at her husband's bookish friend and thought of the sister he might have married, we cannot know. But the circle of it is haunting, the lost suitor drawn back by the same forces that had parted him from his love into the very orbit of her family. Two lives then lived in parallel across the sea from each other, the princess in her German duchy and the duke in his Scottish house, each kept single by a love that had been forbidden, each finding in books and learning a kind of solace, each carrying through a long life the memory, we may suppose, of the bright season when they had hoped to share a life. They never came together again. There was no reunion, no late marriage, no happy ending to set against the cruel parting of their youth. The forces that had divided them in 1761 held them apart for the rest of their lives, and they died, the both of them, unmarried and separate, the love between them never consummated in the marriage they had sought. It is a love story without a happy ending, one of those quiet tragedies that history is full of, the more affecting for its very lack of drama. Two people who loved and were parted and remained faithful in their separate solitudes to the end. And yet there is, in the faithfulness itself, something that lifts the tale above mere sorrow. These two did not simply suffer disappointment and move on, as most people do, to other matches and other lives. They each in their own way kept faith with what they had lost, neither ever marrying another, each living out a long single life in the shadow of a love that had been forbidden. Whatever the full truth of their hearts, which we cannot now recover, the shape of their two lives has the form of a lifelong constancy, a refusal to settle for less than the love that had been denied them. Roxburgh with his books, and Christiane with her court and her studies, the Duke in Scotland and the Princess in Germany, two solitary faithful figures, parted by the sea and by the protocols of kings, each carrying to the grave the memory of the other. It is Christiane's love story, and it ended sadly, as so many of the truest stories do. But the constancy in it, on both sides, gives it a quiet dignity that the mere sadness cannot wholly account for, and makes it worth the remembering. We may ask what Christiane looked like, and what survives to show us her face across the centuries. It is a question worth asking, for the images of a person are a kind of presence, a way of meeting them across the gulf of time. And in Christiane's case, the surviving portraits are among the few direct traces we have of her, the rare windows through which we can actually look upon the woman herself. A handful of likenesses have come down to us, painted in her own day, and they show us a princess of dignity and composure, a serious, cultivated woman of the small German courts, depicted with the gravity and the decorum proper to her rank. The most telling of these portraits show her wearing the insignia of the Order of St. Catherine, the great Russian honour that the Empress Catherine bestowed upon her, the badge and the star and the broad red ribbon that proclaimed her one of the honoured ladies of Europe. We see her with the red sash across her gown and the jewelled marks of the order upon her, the very image of a princess of consequence, dignified and composed, looking out at us across the centuries with a grave and steady gaze. These are not the portraits of a pitiable, forgotten spinster, but of a woman of rank and standing, honoured by an empress, secure in her dignity, and they are a useful corrective to any temptation to imagine Christiane as merely a sad and shadowy figure. She was a person of real consequence in her world, and the portraits show it, the badge of the great order glinting on the breast of the learned princess of the small duchy. There is one curious detail that the portraits have prompted some to remark upon, a particular shape to her eyes, a certain almond cast to them that has led to speculation about her health, the suggestion that some condition might be read in the lines of her face. It is the kind of speculation that the study of old portraits sometimes throws up, the reading of medical clues in the faces of the long dead, and we should be cautious with it, for a painting is not a diagnosis, and the speculations of later observers are not the same as the facts of a life, but it is a reminder, in its way, of how little we truly know of the woman behind the portraits, how thin the record is, how much we must reconstruct and imagine rather than simply read from the evidence. We have her face, or a painter's version of it, and we have the bare facts of her years, and from these slender materials we must build our picture of her, filling the great silences with what we can reasonably suppose, for the truth is that Christiane is one of those figures of the past who survive only in fragments, a few portraits, a few documented facts, a handful of dates and honours and family connections, and around these fragments a great silence, the unrecorded interior and everyday existence of a woman the world did not think worth chronicling. We do not have her letters or her diaries or the accounts of those who knew her well. We do not have the texture of her days, the sound of her voice, the particular cast of her mind and heart. We have the outline, the facts, the portraits, and from these we must do our best to know her, conscious always of how much remains hidden, how much we are guessing, how much of the real Christiane has been lost forever to the silence that swallows the unrecorded lives of the past. And yet, even from the fragments, a figure emerges, and a coherent one. The portraits show us a dignified and serious woman, composed and grave, honoured and secure in her rank. The facts show us a life of learning and faith and faithful family service, of love renounced and duty kept, of quiet dignity maintained across much time of obscurity. The connections show us a woman at the heart of a remarkable family, the sister of one queen and the aunt of another, and the whole, pieced together from the scattered traces, gives us a person we can recognize and respect, even love. Across the centuries, the learned, faithful elder sister who bore her grievous loss with grace and made of her sequestered life something of real worth. The portraits are the face of that person, the grave composed countenance with the red ribbon of the Empress's order looking out at us across the long silence, the rare surviving image of a woman the world almost entirely forgot, and whom this evening, for a little while, we have tried to remember. The last years of Christiane's life fell in a time when the old world she had always known was beginning to tremble, and though she lived out those years in the same quiet German duchy, she had inhabited her entire span long. The great events of the age were drawing near even to her sheltered corner. For Christiane perished in 1794, and that means her final years were lived in the shadow of one of the most earth-shaking events in all of European history, the Great Revolution that had broken out in France in 1789, and was, in those days that followed, convulsing the whole continent and threatening the very foundations of the old order of kings and nobles, and inherited rank that had governed Christiane's entire world. The world Christiane had been born into, and in which she had lived her entire span, was the old Europe of the small courts and the ancient dynasties, the world of dukes and princes and the careful protocols of rank, the world in which a princess might be forbidden to marry the man she loved because the precedence of crowns demanded it. It was a world that had seemed eternal, fixed, unchangeable, the great pyramid of rank rising from the peasant to the king, sanctified by religion and tradition and the long passage of centuries. And in the last years of Christiane's life, that world began to come apart. In France, the people rose against their king. The ancient monarchy was overthrown, and before long the king himself and his queen would go to their deaths beneath the blade, an event that sent a shudder of horror through every court in Europe. The old order of which Christiane was a part, the order that had shaped her every prospect and dictated her great renunciation, was suddenly revealed to be mortal, vulnerable, capable of being swept away. How much of this reached the quiet court of Neustrelitz? How deeply the aging Christiane felt the tremors of the great upheaval, we cannot precisely know. But she cannot have been unaware of it, for the news of such events ran through all the courts of Europe, and a woman of her scholarship and her connections, the sister of a queen and the aunt of a future one, would have followed the cataclysm in France with the same horror and foreboding that gripped all her kind. The execution of a king and a queen, the overturning of the ancient order, the rise of new and terrible forces that threatened every throne, these were not distant abstractions to a princess of the old houses, but matters of the deepest personal concern, the shaking of the very world she belonged to. And there was a particular poignancy in it for her family, for her young niece Louise had just married into Prussia, into one of the very thrones that would soon have to face the storm that was rising out of France, the storm that would, in time, bring the conqueror Napoleon down upon Germany and test the niece's courage to its utmost. Christiane did not live to see the worst of it. The years when Napoleon would overrun Germany, humble Prussia, sweep away the old patchwork of small states, and remake the map of Europe by force. She died in 1794, before the great conqueror had risen to his full height, before her niece Louise would face her famous trial against him, before the old world of the small German courts was finally swept into history. But she died in the early days of its passing, in the time when the first great blows were falling upon the ancient order, and her death came almost as a closing of one age before the opening of another. The world she had known, the world of Miro and Neustrelitz and the careful protocols of rank, the world that had given her a place and taken her love, was beginning to dissolve even as she left it, and there's a kind of fittingness in that, the faithful daughter of the old order departing, just as that order began its long fall. For Christiane was, in every fibre, a woman of that old world, formed by it, and faithful to it, and shaped by its demands. Her great renunciation, the giving up of her love for the sake of dynastic precedence, was the very essence of the old order, the subordination of the individual heart to the cold logic of rank and crown. She had lived by those rules, suffered by them, and kept faith with them all her days. And now, as her days closed, the rules themselves were being challenged, the whole edifice of inherited rank and royal precedence that had governed her existence beginning to shake. One wonders what she made of it in her final years, whether she felt the ground shifting beneath the world she had always known, whether she sensed that the order for which she had sacrificed so much was itself now mortal. She left no word of it, but she died as that old world was beginning to pass, the faithful princess of the small duchy departing just as the age she belonged to began its slow dissolution into the new and violent century that was coming, a century her beloved niece would have to face, and that Christiane herself was spared. The year 1794 was the year that closed Christiane's long, uneventful course, and it closed it twice over, with 2 deaths in a single span of months, for the sister and the brother, who had been the anchors of her existence, were taken from the world that same year, the one just before her, and the one being her own. By then Christiane was an old woman of nearly 60, her long span in the duchy drawing toward its end, her brother Adolphus growing old beside her in the court at Neustrelitz where they had spent so a long span together. The 2 unmarried siblings had grown old in harness, the bachelor duke and the spinster princess, sharing their sequestered existence to the last. And then, in the summer of that year, the partnership of their long companionship was broken. In the June of 1794, the brother died. Adolphus Frederick, who had become duke as a young man after their father's death, who had ruled the small duchy through all the long decades, who had been Christiane's companion and the centre of her daily round for the whole of her adult years, passed away, and the duchy passed to another of their brothers. For Christiane, the loss must have been profound, for Adolphus had been more than a brother to her. He had been the partner of her days, the one with whom she had shared her home and her days and her purpose over all the years since their youth. The bachelor duke and his spinster sister had been in a sense a kind of married pair without the marriage, two unwed siblings who had made their life together, and his death left her, in her old age, suddenly alone in a way she had not been since childhood. The brother she had served and companioned for so long was gone, and with him went the central structure of her daily existence. She did not long outlive him. Only a few months later, in the August of that same year, 1794, Christiane herself died, at Neustrelitz, the town that had been her home through the long Neustrelitz years. She was buried, in the end, where she had begun, in the church at Miro, the very town where she had been born nearly 60 years before, brought back at the last to the modest place by the lake where her whole story had started. There is a kind of completeness in that. The woman who had stayed in her small German world all her years returning, in death, to the very spot of her birth, her long still existence closing where it had opened, in the modest town of Murrow by its grey gleaming lake. The eldest daughter of the house came home at the last, to lie in the church of her childhood, her wanderings, such as they were, all ended, her long faithful life complete. Across the sea, in England, her sister, the Queen, received the news of Christiane's death. Charlotte was at Weymouth at the time, on the coast, with the royal family, in the midst of the crowded public life of a British queen, when the word came that her elder had died in the small German duchy of their childhood, and the court was ordered into mourning, the formal black of royal grief put on for the passing of the Queen's sister, the woman who had been carried back to lie in the church at Miro. Imagine the moment for Charlotte, the Queen in her English watering place, receiving across the sea the news that the elder sister was gone, the sister who had helped to raise her in the nursery at Miro, the sister with whom she had exchanged faithful letters through all the many decades of their separation, the sister whose own happiness her crown had quietly cost. Whatever passed through the Queen's heart in that moment, whatever memories rose of their shared childhood and their long correspondence and the strange cruel symmetry of their two lives, she ordered her court into mourning for Christiane, the public mark of a private grief, the formal acknowledgment that the sister left behind had been to the end beloved. And so Christiane's long tranquil existence came to its close in the same year that took her brother, in the town of her later years, with her body carried back to the church of her birth and her sister, the Queen mourning her across the sea. It was an ending without drama, as her course had been a life without drama, a quiet closing of a quiet existence. She had not died a queen, or a duchess, or the wife of the man she loved. She had died a spinster princess of a small German duchy, an unmarried sister and aunt, the lady of a provincial court, honoured in her own modest way, but unknown to the wide world. And yet she had lived a life of real dignity and real worth, faithful to her family and her duty, and the memory of her one deep love, learned and cultivated, and quietly strong, bearing without bitterness the great loss at the centre of her tale. The world took little notice of her death, as it had taken little notice of her existence. But the Queen across the sea mourned her, and the church at Miro received her, and the long, faithful story of the sister who stayed behind was, at the last, complete. And so we come to the end of Christiane's long, tranquil story, and to the question of what we are to make of it. This life lived almost entirely in obscurity, in the shadow of a famous sister, marked at its centre by a great renunciation. The world remembers Charlotte, the younger sister, the Queen, her name attached to flowers and places, and a whole royal line. The world has very nearly forgotten Christiane, the elder, who stayed behind. And yet, when you sit with her history, as we have done this evening, it has a quiet power that the grander tale of her sister cannot quite match. The power of a life that asked for little and bore much, that was denied its dearest wish and made of what was left something dignified and whole. Hers was, above all, a story of faithfulness, and faithfulness of several kinds. She was faithful to the man she loved, never marrying another after she was forbidden to marry him, keeping in her long single life a kind of constancy to the love that had been denied her. She was faithful to her family, pouring into the service of her mother and her brother the devotion she might have given to a husband and children of her own, the eldest daughter to the last, the steady presence at the heart of the family she had served since childhood. She was faithful to her sister, keeping their bond alive across the sea through all the much time of separation, refusing to let the cruel symmetry of their fates poison the love between them, writing faithfully to the Queen whose crown had cost her so much. And she was faithful to herself, to her own quiet dignity and her own deep faith, bearing her great loss without bitterness, building on her diminished prospects, a life of learning and service and standing, asking no pity and making no complaint. There is a particular kind of greatness in a life like that, a greatness the world is slow to see because it makes no noise and seeks no stage. Christiane did nothing the histories record in their bold chapters. She fought no battles, ruled no kingdoms, bore no royal heirs, left no monuments in stone. She lived quietly in a small duchy, loved and lost, served her family, kept her belief, and died where she was born. By the loud measures of the world, it was a small life, an unimportant life, a life easily overlooked. But by the quieter measures that matter more in the end, the measures of constancy and dignity and the patient bearing of sorrow, it was a life of real beauty. The learned elder sister who gave up her love so that her sister's crown might sit easily, and then lived out her long days with grace and without complaint, asked something of our respect that the merely fortunate cannot. She is one of the countless quiet women of history whom the records almost lose, and she is worth the finding, worth the remembering, for the steady, faithful courage of her unremarkable, unforgettable life. Perhaps that is the truest thing her story has to give us, the reminder that the lives the world forgets are not therefore lives without worth, that there is a quiet heroism in the bearing of disappointment, a real nobility in the faithful living of a diminished life. Christiane was not a queen. She was the sister of a queen, the one left behind, the one whose happiness was the price of another's glory, and she carried that lot across the whole of her long life, with a grace and a constancy that her famous sister, for all her crowns and palaces, would have been hard-pressed to better. The bird of paradise flower carries Charlotte's name down the centuries. Nothing carries Christiane's. But the history of her unhurried, faithful life, once you have heard it, is not so easily forgotten, and the sister who stayed behind deserves, at the last, to be remembered alongside the sister who sailed away. Before I leave you to your rest tonight, let me say one quiet thing. If you have found something of value in this long, slow evening with the sister who stayed behind, and if these gentle journeys into the forgotten corners of the past are a comfort to you as the day ends, then you are always welcome to stay a while in this quiet company, and a gentle way to find your way back on another night when sleep is slow in coming is simply to follow along so that the next of these evenings will be waiting for you when you need it. There is no hurry in it, and nothing is asked of you but to rest. Reinge. And now the hour is late, and Christiane's long unhurried story is told, and there is nothing left for you to do but let it all settle softly into the dark, and let yourself drift down towards sleep. Let the small castle by the lake, and the two sisters in the nursery, and the bright brief season of a love that was not to be, and the long faithful years that followed, all sink gently away now into the past from which we called them up for a while tonight. You have travelled a long way this evening, into a small and tender corner of the vanished world, and now it is time to rest. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.